She arrived with nothing, no money, no family, no one waiting for her. Evelyn Cross was just a young widow, battered by life, seeking work on a remote farm in the middle of a harsh winter. The cold, stony farm owner told her, "Clean the stables, don't come near my house." But the cries of two abandoned children in the darkness, she couldn't turn away. And that very kindness turned her into an enemy of the entire land. If you want to know what a woman with nothing can accomplish, watch until the end. And comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. The wagon driver didn't say a word for the last 4 miles. He just kept his eyes on the road, or what passed for a road out here. 2 ruts cut into frozen mud, running between dead grass and bare trees that rattled in the wind like they were trying to shake something loose. Evelyn Cross sat in the back with her travel bag wedged between her knees and her coat pulled tight at the collar, watching the sky go from gray to a darker, meaner shade of gray. She'd been watching the weather change all afternoon, and she knew what it meant. She'd grown up in Kansas. She knew exactly what that sky meant. She just didn't have anywhere else to go. The driver finally pulled up at a gate made of rough-cut timber. A sign hung from a crossbar overhead, burned into wood with a branding iron, Black Ridge Ranch. Below it, someone had nailed a smaller board, newer, the letters crooked and pressed too hard. No solicitors, no drifters, trespassers dealt with. The driver turned on his bench and looked down at her. He had kind eyes. That almost made it worse. "This is as far as I go," he said. "I know." Evelyn climbed down. Her boots hit the frozen ground and the cold came right up through the soles. "Thank you for the ride." He hesitated, looked at the gate, looked back at her. "You sure about this, ma'am?" She wasn't. She hadn't been sure about anything in 6 months, not since the morning she'd woken up to find Thomas already gone, cold in the bed beside her, and their little girl already 3 months in the ground, and the banknote already 3 months overdue. She had been sure about plenty of things before all that. After, she'd just learned to put one foot in front of the other and keep moving until something stopped her. "I'm sure," she said. He clicked his tongue and turned the horses around, and she stood there watching the wagon disappear back down the road until she couldn't hear the wheels anymore. Then it was just wind. Wind and the creak of that sign overhead and the faint, far-off sound of cattle somewhere beyond the tree line. She picked up her bag and walked through the gate. The ranch itself was bigger than she'd expected from the advertisement. She'd answered it out of a Helena newspaper, 3 weeks old by the time it reached the boarding house, where she'd been sleeping 2 to a room and working off her keep by doing other women's laundry. The ad had said, "Domestic help wanted. Black Ridge Ranch, 20 miles south of Cutter's Creek. Inquire at the post office." She'd inquired. A letter had come back, short, barely a paragraph, written in a hand that pressed hard enough to leave marks on the paper underneath. It said she was to report by the 1st of November and that room and board were included and that wages were $8 a month. It was signed C. Hale. She'd written back the same day. She'd had nothing to lose. The main house was a 2-story structure of dark timber and stone, solid in the way that frontier buildings were only solid when someone had built them to last through something. Wind, drought, fire, grief. There was a porch that ran the full width of the front, and a light burning in one of the downstairs windows, and smoke coming from 2 different chimneys. It should have looked welcoming. It looked like a face that had forgotten how to smile. She knocked on the front door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. The door swung open and a man looked down at her from inside the warm light, and her first thought, which she would never say aloud to anyone, was that he looked like something the frontier had ground down and then hardened into a different shape entirely. He was tall, wide through the shoulders. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who worked outdoors every day of their lives, and there was a scar along his left jaw, pale against the darker skin, and his eyes were the color of a winter creek. Not cold exactly, but not warm either. Just flat, assessing. He looked at her bag. He looked at her coat. He looked at her face. "You're the one from Helena," he said. "Evelyn Cross." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment like he was deciding something. Then he shook it once, briefly, and dropped it. "Colton Hale." He stepped back from the door but didn't open it any wider. "I need to tell you some things before you come in." All right. The advertisement said domestic help. That was my foreman's wording, and it wasn't accurate. He said it without apology, just statement of fact. What I need is someone to work the stables, morning feeding, evening feeding, mucking out, general care. I've got 11 horses and my stable hand quit 3 weeks ago, and I haven't found a replacement. Evelyn looked at him. You need a stable hand. I need someone willing to do the work a stable hand does, yes. The advertisement said domestic. I know what it said. She'd come 20 miles in a wagon that smelled like wet dog, in a coat with a hole in the left elbow she'd been ignoring for 2 months, on the strength of an advertisement that had apparently lied to her. She looked past him into the house. Warm light, the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, a hallway rug that had seen better days but was still a hallway rug. And then she looked at the sky again, which had gone from dark gray to purple black while she'd been standing on this porch. I've worked with horses before, she said. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. Have you? My father kept 5. I was the one who took care of them from the time I was 8. He studied her. She had the sense of being weighed and found either adequate or inadequate, and she wasn't sure which answer she wanted him to land on. Wages are the same, he said finally. $8, room in the bunkhouse. The advertisement said a room was included. The bunkhouse has rooms. With the ranch hands. With the ranch hands. She thought about the boarding house in Helena, the smell of other women's dirty clothes, and the sound of the woman in the next room coughing through the wall all night, and the landlady who'd looked at Evelyn with that particular kind of pity that felt worse than contempt. I'll take it, she said. He nodded once. There's one more thing. He said it like he'd been waiting to say it, like it was the thing he actually needed to get to. I have children, twins, a boy and a girl, 7 years old. They're... He stopped, looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, started again. They've had a difficult year. I need you to understand that your work is the stables, not the house, not them. You stay away from the main house and you do your job and we'll get along fine. Are we clear? We're clear, she said. She didn't ask about the wife. She'd heard enough in the voice not to. His name was Pete Gruder, and he was the foreman, and he did not try to hide the fact that he considered her presence an inconvenience. He was a stocky man, 50s, with a gray mustache that he kept trimmed in a way that suggested he'd cared about his appearance at some point and never quite stopped. He showed her the bunkhouse, a long, low building with 6 cots, a wood stove, and 2 small rooms partitioned off at the far end. And he showed her the stables, and he told her where to find the feed, and where to find the tools, and where not to go, which was everywhere except the stables, and the bunkhouse, and the well. You need anything from the main house, you ask me, he said. You don't go up there yourself. Mr. Hale said the same. Good. Then you understand. He looked her up and down, not in the way that some men looked at women, more like he was looking at a piece of equipment and finding it less useful than advertised. You ever actually worked a stable? Yes, a real stable, not just some family's riding horse. 11 horses, you said. Mr. Hale's got 11. One of them you'll want to watch. Big roan, 3rd stall on the left. He bites. What's his name? Gruder looked at her like she'd said something strange. Horse doesn't need a name to do what it's supposed to do. She thought that was probably also how he felt about her. She said nothing. The other ranch hands, 4 of them, were named Walt, Denny, Cass, and a man everyone called Shorty, who was, remarkably, not short at all. They ate dinner together in the bunkhouse most nights, at a table that only barely fit 5 people and now had to fit 6. Walt moved down the bench to make room for her without being asked, which she noted and was grateful for. Denny and Cass ate without looking at her. Shorty looked at her too much, in a way that wasn't threatening so much as relentlessly curious, like she was a phenomenon he was trying to classify. You a widow? He asked on the first night, over beans and salt pork. Shorty, Walt said. What? I'm asking. I am, Evelyn said. No reason not to say it. It was just a fact now, like her hair color or her boot size. Recent? 6 months. Shorty absorbed this. Where from? Kansas originally, Helena most recently. What brought you all the way out here? Walt gave him a longer look this time. Shorty held his fork and seemed to reconsider. "Sorry," he said. "I don't always know when I'm being rude." "You're not being rude," she said. "The wages and the room are what brought me here, same as most people." That was true enough. It was also only part of the truth, but the rest of it, the part about needing to be somewhere she'd never been, somewhere with no memory of her attached to any of the furniture or any of the streets, that wasn't anyone's business but her own. Tot. The first morning, she woke before the others. She dressed in the dark, found the lantern she'd left on the floor beside the cot, and walked across the frozen yard to the stables. The wind had picked up overnight, and the temperature had dropped enough that her breath came out in thick clouds, and the latch on the stable door was so cold it burned through her gloves when she grabbed it. Inside was warmth, relative warmth, the living warmth of horses in an enclosed space. The smell hit her first, hay and manure, and the particular animal musk of 11 large creatures. And something in her chest released. She hadn't known she was holding anything until it let go. She stood inside the door and breathed it in for a moment before she lit the lantern and hung it on the hook. They moved in their stalls at the light, heads lifted. One of them, a bay near the front, turned to look at her with that specific horse expression that was both alert and deeply unimpressed. "Morning," she said. She started at the front and worked her way back. She'd learned the feeding routine from Gruder's cursory instructions the night before, and she'd spent enough time around horses to know that routine mattered more than almost anything. Horses were creatures of pattern. They wanted to know what came next, and the fastest way to earn their distrust was to be unpredictable. So she moved at the same pace through each stall, spoke quietly, didn't rush, and let each horse settle back into their morning before she moved to the next. The roan was in the third stall on the left, as advertised. He was big, maybe 16 hands, with a walleye and a scar on his chest that looked like it had come from barbed wire some years back. He had his hindquarters toward her when she opened the stall. "I know," she said. "I'm new. You don't know me yet." The roan didn't turn. She set the feed bucket down inside the door and stepped back and waited. After a moment, he turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. She stayed still. "Take your time," she said. He turned the rest of the way around, slow and suspicious, and watched her for a long moment before he decided the bucket was more interesting than she was and lowered his head to eat. She stood there while he ate, and when he was done, she reached out slowly and laid her hand on his neck. He twitched, didn't move away. She stood with her hand on his neck and listened to the wind work at the stable walls and felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months, something she didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness, not exactly. More like the possibility of it. Like the ground was still frozen solid, but something underneath was still alive. She was in the last stall mucking out when she heard it. Voices. Small voices coming from somewhere above her. She looked up and realized that there was a loft above the back half of the stable, accessible by a ladder in the corner, and 2 small faces were looking down at her from the loft opening. A boy and a girl, both dark-haired, both staring. She stared back. "You're the new stable lady," the boy said. "I suppose I am." "Papa said we're not supposed to come in here when you're working," the girl said. "But here you are," Evelyn said. "We come here every morning," the boy said, with the particular defensive tone of a child who suspects he's been caught, but isn't ready to admit it. "Before you came, we used to feed the horses." "Henry," the girl said quietly. "What?" "It's true." Evelyn looked at the pitchfork in her hands and then up at them. The boy, Henry, apparently, was maybe an inch taller than his sister and had the same eyes as his father, that flat Winter Creek color, but where Colton Hale's eyes were closed up tight, these ones were still open, still looking for something. The girl had her arms crossed over her chest like she'd already decided to be careful. "What's your name?" Evelyn asked the girl. A pause. "Clara?" "Well, Henry and Clara." She kept her voice even, conversational. "I'm not going to tell your father you were here if you don't want me to, but if you want to come in while I'm working, you'd be doing me a favor if you'd let me know you were up there, so I don't accidentally disturb you." Henry and Clara exchanged a look, that particular wordless twin communication that always seemed to operate on a frequency nobody else could hear. "All right," Henry said. "All right," Clara echoed. She went back to mucking out the stall. After a moment, she heard them moving around in the loft, the rustle of hay, the soft thump of small feet. They stayed up there until she was nearly done, And then they disappeared back the way they'd come, quiet as cats. And she didn't see them again that morning. She didn't mention it to anyone. The trouble with the ranch hand started on the fourth day. It wasn't dramatic. It rarely was, in her experience. Most trouble built itself quietly, little brick by little brick, until the wall was up and you'd somehow failed to notice it going up. Cass was the one who started it, though she'd almost say he didn't mean to. He just said at breakfast, while she was pouring herself coffee, "Hale's going to regret this." She looked at him. "Hiring a woman for a man's job," he said. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the table, to Denny and Shorty and Walt. "Never works out." "She's doing the work," Walt said, mild, non-combative. "So far," Cass said. Denny nodded at this with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for permission to nod. She sat down with her coffee and ate her breakfast and said nothing. There was no point. There was never any point. She knew what the dynamic was going to be. She'd have to prove herself, and proving herself would take time, and in the meantime there would be comments like this one, little comments, not quite directed at her, but not quite not, either. She'd dealt with this before, not in a stable specifically, but in every other situation in her adult life that had required her to be somewhere she wasn't expected. She finished her breakfast, washed her bowl, and went to work. That evening, she was at the water trough near the east paddock when she heard Gruder talking to someone around the corner of the stable wall. She wasn't trying to listen. She was just slower to move away than she should have been. "Said she was up near the house," Gruder was saying. "Cass saw her." A pause. Then Colton Hale's voice, quieter but recognizable. "What was she doing?" "Just standing there, looking at the house? Maybe looking for the children? I don't know." Another pause. "You told her." "I told her. She knows the rules. Make sure she does." A beat. "I mean it, Pete. I can't have someone coming in and confusing them. They're just starting to settle." She moved away from the trough without making noise. The cold had gotten into her fingers through the gloves, and her back ached from the day's work, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than muscles. She walked back to the bunkhouse and she sat on her cot in the dark for a while before she lit her lamp. She hadn't been looking for the children. She'd been looking at the house because she'd noticed that one of the upstairs windows had a broken latch, and the cold would be getting in, and she'd been trying to figure out if it was her place to mention it or not. She decided it wasn't. She decided to stay in her lane, as Thomas used to say. Stay in your lane, Evie. Stop trying to solve every problem you see. Not every problem is yours. She missed him so much it was like a physical hole in her chest sometimes, a spot where the air went through and came out cold on the other side. Not because they'd had a perfect marriage. They hadn't, not even close. He'd been stubborn and sometimes unkind, and there were years when she'd felt more like two people living separately in the same house than a couple. But he'd been hers, her person, her problem, and he was gone, and their daughter was gone. And this frozen ranch at the edge of the world with a man who didn't want her near his children, and a foreman who didn't trust her, and a roan horse who was only just beginning to tolerate her. This was what was left. She lit the lamp. She had $8 coming in a month. She had a roof. She had 11 horses who were starting to know her name. It was enough. It had to be enough. The night the twins cried, she heard them through the walls. Not through the bunkhouse walls. The main house was too far for that. She heard them because she'd woken at 2 a.m. and gone outside because she couldn't sleep, and the cold air sometimes helped, and the night was still enough, clear enough, that sound carried. Thin, reedy crying. The sound of children who had been crying for a while already, past the sharp, urgent crying and into the exhausted kind. She stood in the yard in her coat and her boots unlaced and listened. The light in the main house was out. All of it. Every window dark. She stood there for a long time, longer than she should have, hands deep in her coat pockets and her boots crunching the frozen mud where she shifted her weight, listening to those children cry in the dark. She went back inside. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and told herself it wasn't her business. She fell asleep an hour later and dreamed about her daughter. Not a nightmare. Just a dream where Lily was there, solid and warm and smelling like the particular baby smell that Evelyn had spent months after her death trying to remember and always finding just slightly out of reach. In the dream, Lily was sitting up and reaching for her, and Evelyn reached back, and then she woke up and it was 4 a.m. and the bunkhouse was dark and she was alone. She got dressed in the dark. She went to the stables. She started the morning feeding earlier than usual. The roan turned toward her when she came in this time, without waiting. She took that as a small victory. You learned to take the small ones. "Good morning," she said, and she meant it, or she tried to, and she thought that was probably the same thing. Henry appeared in the loft at 6:30, alone this time. He sat with his legs hanging over the edge and watched her work in silence for a while. "Clara's sick," he said finally. "I'm sorry to hear that." "She gets headaches. Mama used to put a cold cloth on her forehead." He said it the way children said things about people who were gone, matter of fact and devastating in equal measure. "Mrs. Porter doesn't know how to do it right. She says just to leave her alone and let her sleep." Mrs. Porter was the housekeeper she'd gathered, a woman who came in 3 days a week from the nearest town, which was not very near at all. "That can work too," Evelyn said carefully. "Sometimes rest is what a headache needs." Henry was quiet again. She moved to the next stall. "Do you know how?" he asked. She looked up at him. His face was very serious for a 7-year-old. Too serious, really. The kind of serious that happened to children when the adults around them were too distracted by their own grief to manage anything lighter. "Yes," she said. "I know how." He considered this. Then he climbed down the ladder and went back to the house, and she went back to the stalls, and she told herself she'd done the right thing by not offering more than he'd asked for. But she stood in the last stall for a moment longer than she needed to, listening to the wind, and the crying was gone now. The night was over, and it wasn't her place, and she knew it wasn't her place, and she picked up the pitchfork and went back to work. At the end of her first week, she found a list. It was tucked under her breakfast bowl, not by any of the ranch hands as far as she could tell, because she was first to the table. A folded piece of paper with that same hard-pressing handwriting from the original letter. She opened it. It was a list of tasks, stable maintenance, things that hadn't been kept up while the position was vacant. One of the stall doors had a split board that needed replacing. The water pipes running to the stable had a slow freeze risk. 3 of the horses were due for hoof trimming. The tack needed cleaning and oiling. Long list, practical. Nothing on it that she wasn't already capable of doing. At the bottom, in slightly smaller handwriting, the roan's name is Ajax. He belonged to my wife. He's been difficult since she died. She read that last sentence twice. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, and thought about a man who missed his wife badly enough that her horse had gone strange with grief too, and who didn't know how to say any of that except in small, handwritten footnotes at the bottom of task lists. She thought about a lot of things that morning, working through the stable with Ajax watching her from his stall. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way grief didn't look the same on everyone. Some people wore it out in the open like a wound, and some people put it somewhere internal and built walls around it until the walls were the whole person. She thought about 2 dark-haired children crying in the dark, and a father with the lights out and no cold cloth for a headache. When she got to Ajax's stall that morning, she stopped at the door and said, "Ajax?" His head came up fast. "There you are," she said. "That's who you are." She stayed with him a little longer that morning, not doing anything special, not trying to fix anything or solve anything or earn anything. Just standing with her hand on his neck in the warm living smell of the stable, while the wind built against the walls outside and the temperature dropped toward what promised to be a hard, mean, unforgiving winter. It was enough, she told herself. For today, it was enough. The cold that settled over Black Ridge Ranch in the second week of November was the kind that didn't announce itself. It just arrived overnight and stayed, pressing down on everything. The ground, the buildings, the animals, the people, with a patient, indifferent weight. Evelyn woke each morning before light and went to the stables and worked through the feeding and the mucking and the small maintenance tasks she'd found on that list, and by the time the sky went from black to gray, she'd already been working for 2 hours. Her hands were permanently chapped now, the knuckles cracked and sore, and she'd taken to rubbing them with the same liniment she used on the horse's legs, which Walt had noticed and said nothing about, which she appreciated. The days had settled into something like a rhythm. Not comfort, it wasn't that. Not yet, maybe not ever. But rhythm, which was its own kind of survival. She knew which horses needed extra time and which ones wanted to be left alone while they ate. She knew that the split board in stall 4 needed shimming before it could be properly replaced. And she'd found a piece of scrap timber in the back of the tool room that would do the job. She knew that Gruder did his rounds at 7 and again at 4, and that during the hours between he was usually in the bunkhouse office working on the ledgers he never let anyone else look at. She also knew, by the end of the second week, that Clara's headaches came every few days and that Henry always came to the stable alone when they did. He never said much. He'd climb up to the loft or sometimes sit on an overturned bucket near Ajax's stall. Ajax had decided to tolerate him, which surprised her given the horse's general policy toward human beings. And he'd watch her work and sometimes ask questions. Practical questions, mostly. Why did she check that horse's feet that way? What the difference was between the two kinds of hay she kept in separate sections. Whether it was true that horses could smell fear. Mostly they smell uncertainty, she told him. One afternoon when the light was going early, and she was wrapping a poultice on the bay mare's left foreleg. Fear and uncertainty smell about the same to a horse, but it's really the uncertainty that bothers them. A scared person who knows what they're doing is fine. A calm person who doesn't know what they're doing makes a horse nervous. Henry sat with this. He had that quality she'd noticed of actually sitting with things rather than just moving past them. Is that true for people too? He asked. She tied off the bandage and straightened up. Might be. Papa always knows what he's doing. She thought about the note at the bottom of the task list. She thought about every window dark and 2 children crying in the night. I'm sure he does, she said, and went on to the next stall. Oh. It was the 12th night when she broke the rule. She hadn't planned it. She'd been up late, couldn't sleep again. The particular insomnia that had followed her from Helena, that hour between 2 and 3 when her mind went to all the things she'd rather it didn't. And she'd gone outside for air, and the crying was there again. The same thin, exhausted sound, and this time there was something different about it. Not just sad, frightened. Clara's voice and Henry's voice both, braided together in the dark. She stood in the yard and told herself, not your place. She stood there for another 2 minutes and listened to those children be frightened in the dark, in a house with all its lights out. And then she walked to the main house and knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. A light came on upstairs. Footsteps. The door opened and Colton Hale stood there in a shirt hastily buttoned and suspenders not yet pulled up over his shoulders, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, not quite, more like a man who'd been braced for something bad and wasn't sure yet if this was it or not. They're frightened, she said. Both of them. I could hear them from the yard. He looked past her into the dark like the yard might have an explanation he was missing. I'll handle it, he said. All right. She didn't move. He looked at her. Miss Cross? I hear them most nights, Mr. Hale. Not like this, but crying. Most nights. Something moved in his face, something he didn't let all the way through. They've had a hard year. I told you that. You did. I'm doing the best I can. She believed him. She could see it, actually. The exhaustion in him, not the tiredness of physical work, but the deeper exhaustion of someone who'd been holding something up for a long time and couldn't figure out how to put it down. She believed he was doing the best he could. She just thought his best, right now, wasn't enough, and she didn't know how to say that without it sounding like an accusation. I used to sing to a child, she said, when she couldn't sleep. He went very still. I know it's not my place, she said quickly. I know what you told me, but I can hear them, and I'm awake anyway, and if it would help, my wife used to sing to them. He said it flat, like something he'd rehearsed saying without feeling. I can't. I've tried. I can't do it the same way. It doesn't have to be the same way. A long silence. From upstairs, Clara's voice, the specific sound of a child who's frightened and tired and too proud to admit they want someone. Colton Hale stepped back from the door. It wasn't a welcome exactly. It was just space. But she walked through it and went up the stairs and found the room at the end of the hall where the light was coming through the gap under the door. And she knocked and went in. They were both in Clara's bed, Henry with his arm around his sister in the protective older sibling way, even though they were the same age. She'd gathered he was older by about 20 minutes and had apparently never let Clara forget it. Clara's face was blotched from crying. Henry's was studiedly calm in the way that meant he'd been scared and didn't want to show it. Hey, Evelyn said. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat down between the window and the bed. I heard you. We're fine, Henry said. Okay, Clara sniffled. There was a sound outside. Wind, Evelyn said. It does something weird when it goes past the corner of the house. Sounds like something moving. It's just air. Clara looked at her. How do you know? Because I lay awake listening to it from the bunkhouse and I figured it out. She settled back in the chair. Do you want me to stay for a while? Henry looked like he was going to say no. Clara got there first. Yes, Clara said. So she stayed. She didn't sing right away. She just sat in the chair and talked to them, quietly, about nothing in particular. The horses, Ajax's new habit of turning toward the door when he heard her coming, the way the bay mare had taken to leaning against the stall wall while she worked, like a cat looking for pets. Henry stopped being studied calm and started actually relaxing, which she thought was probably harder for him. Clara's eyes got heavier. She sang eventually. Not anything formal. She didn't have a performer's voice, never had. Just a low, shapeless kind of song, something her own mother had sung that she wasn't sure had actual words or was just melody. It didn't matter. Clara was asleep before she'd gone through it twice. Henry lasted another few minutes, fighting it the way he fought everything, and then went under too. She sat in the chair for a while after. The room was warmer than she'd expected. The fire in the small hearth still putting out heat, and there was a smell to it, children and wood smoke and something floral she couldn't identify, probably from a drawer sachet or an old pillowcase. And she sat with her hands in her lap and felt the particular combination of ache and something almost like peace that came with being near sleeping children. She was almost at the door when she nearly walked into Colton Hale. He was standing in the hallway just outside the door. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He was looking past her at the room, at the two dark heads on the pillow. They're both out, she said quietly. He nodded. He didn't move. She waited. Thank you, he said finally. The words came out like they cost him something. It's nothing. She meant it to sound lighter than it did. It didn't come out light. He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time. Not the assessing look of the first night, but something different, something she didn't have a name for. It lasted only a second. Then he looked away. I'll be up early, she said. The stables. I know. She went back down the stairs and out into the cold and walked across the dark yard to the bunkhouse, and she lay down on her cot and closed her eyes. And for the first time in weeks, she fell asleep quickly and didn't dream about anything at all. Cass saw her come out of the main house. She found this out 3 days later, when Shorty told her. Shorty, who had apparently decided at some point during her first 2 weeks that warning her about things was his responsibility, the way he'd warned her about Ajax and about the loose board on the bunkhouse step, and about Gruder's tendency to be unreasonable before his first cup of coffee. Just so you know, Shorty said, appearing beside her at the water trough with the expression of a man carrying a package he wasn't sure how to hand over. Cass told Gruder he saw you going in and out of the house late at night. She kept filling the trough. I was there once. I know. I told him that. Thank you. Gruder didn't take it the way I hoped. Shorty picked at a splinter on the trough's edge. He's got a particular story in his head about what's happening. Well, what story is that? Shorty looked uncomfortable. The one where you're not really here for the stable work. She set down the bucket. Say it plainly, please. He thinks you're positioning yourself with Mr. Hale for his money. He said it quickly, like speed made it less unpleasant. I don't think that. Walt doesn't think that. But Cass and Denny have taken to it because it's a better story than Widow Woman Needed Work, I suppose. She stood with that for a moment. The cold air moved against her face. Somewhere above the stable roof, a hawk was doing slow circles. And Gruder? She asked. Gruder's protective of Mr. Hale. Has been for years since... He stopped. Since Mrs. Hale passed. He thinks you're trouble. I went to comfort 2 frightened children in the middle of the night. I know that. Once. I know. Shorty looked genuinely sorry, which she appreciated more than she'd expected to. I'm just telling you so you're not caught off guard. She picked up the empty bucket. I appreciate it. She went back to work, and she turned over what Shorty had said, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she wasn't entirely surprised. She'd walked into a man's house in the middle of the night. It didn't matter what she'd done there. It didn't matter that the door had been opened from the inside. In a small, isolated community where people had nothing but each other to talk about, appearances were the only currency that didn't depreciate, and she'd just spent some of hers without thinking. The question was what to do about it, and the honest answer was, not much. She could stop going to the house, which she'd been doing anyway since that one night. She hadn't been back, hadn't been invited back, and the twins had been quiet on the night since, or at least quiet enough that she hadn't heard them from the yard. She could keep doing her work. She could be as unremarkable and unobjectionable as possible, and let the story die for lack of fuel. What she couldn't do was unring the bell. Cass had seen her, and Cass had told Gruder, and now there was a story in the world with her in it that she hadn't written and couldn't rewrite. She'd been in that position before. She knew how to carry it. Moriichi. Gruder came to the stable 2 days later. It was morning, early, while she was still working through the feeding. She heard him come in and she didn't stop what she was doing, just kept moving through the routine, because stopping would have made it into more of a confrontation than it needed to be. He stood near the door and watched her for a moment. Miss Cross? Mr. Gruder. I think we need to have a conversation. All right. She finished with the feed bucket and hung it back on the hook and turned to face him. She kept her hands loose, her posture open. Nothing to hide, nothing to defend. Just a woman waiting to hear what she was about to be accused of. You were seen leaving the main house. He said it without preamble, which she respected, even if she didn't enjoy it. I was in the main house once, almost 2 weeks ago. The children were frightened and crying, and Mr. Hale let me in to settle them. Mr. Hale let you in? Yes. At 2 in the morning. Around there. Gruder's jaw moved. He had that habit, working his jaw when he was thinking something he wasn't sure he should say out loud. I'm going to be direct with you. Please. Mr. Hale is a wealthy man who's been alone for a year and who isn't always thinking clearly when it comes to people who show him a particular kind of attention. There are people who take advantage of that. She looked at him steadily. You think I'm one of those people? I think you came here with very little and that this is a very large ranch. It was said flatly, without cruelty, which almost made it worse because it meant he believed it. He wasn't trying to wound her. He was stating what he considered a fact. I came here for $8 a month and a bed, she said, which is what was advertised. And the late-night visits to the house? One visit, which I've already explained. She kept her voice level. I understand that you're trying to protect him. I can see that you've been doing it for a long time and that you're probably good at it. But I'm here to work, and the only reason I went to that house was because I could hear those children crying in the dark, and I couldn't stand listening to it anymore. She paused. If that makes me a threat in your estimation, I don't know what to tell you. A long silence. Ajax shifted in his stall. One of the other horses, the gray gelding 2 down, bumped his nose against the stall door. Stay out of the house, Gruder said. That's all I'm saying. Do your job and stay out of the house, and there won't be any problem. We agree, she said. He left. She went back to work. She didn't let herself think too hard about his expression as he'd turned away, which had been not satisfied exactly. Something more complicated. Something that might have been, if she was reading it right, a man who'd wanted her to argue and was slightly wrong-footed that she hadn't. She didn't think about it. She had horses to feed. It was Clara who made things complicated again, not on purpose. Clara was, Evelyn had come to understand, a child who did things on purpose and then found that the purposes had consequences she hadn't fully thought through, which made her entirely normal and also occasionally difficult. She arrived at the stable on a Thursday afternoon, alone, while Henry was apparently doing lessons with the tutor who came 3 times a week. Clara usually stayed inside during lessons. She did them faster than Henry, Evelyn had gathered, and then had nowhere to go with the remaining time. She arrived at the stable door in a coat that was buttoned wrong and boots that weren't fully laced and stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested she'd been debating this decision for some time and had finally made it through a combination of boredom and something more complicated. Can I come in? She asked. Your father said you shouldn't be here when I'm working, Evelyn said. Not unkindly, just stating. I know what Papa said. And? Clara considered. I won't tell him if you won't. Evelyn looked at her. Clara looked back. She had her mother's stubbornness, Evelyn suspected. Not that she'd known the woman, but you could see it in the set of her jaw. Something inherited from someone whose presence was everywhere on this ranch, without being anywhere. Come in, Evelyn said, but button your coat properly. It's cold. Clara came in and rebuttoned her coat and settled on the overturned bucket that had become, by unspoken agreement, the children's spot. She sat with her elbows on her knees and watched Evelyn work on the tack, the same methodical cleaning and oiling she'd been working through all week. Henry says you know about horses, Clara said. Some. He says Ajax likes you. Ajax tolerates me. It's not the same thing. Henry says you told him fear and uncertainty smell the same to a horse. She glanced up. He remembered that. Henry remembers everything. Clara said it without envy, just fact. He's going to be a lawyer, Papa says. What are you going to be? Clara looked at her with an expression that suggested this was not a question she'd been asked before, at least not seriously. I don't know, something. She poked at a piece of straw on the ground with her boot toe. Mama was going to teach me to sew, but she got sick before we started. Evelyn kept her hands moving on the tack, steady, nothing to show. I can sew, she said. Clara looked up fast, then slower. Papa wouldn't like that. Probably not. A silence, then, did you mean it when you said that? I said I can sew. That's just true. You know what I meant. She did. She set down the bridle she'd been working on and looked at Clara properly. The girl was watching her with that 7-year-old's version of careful, the kind that had developed fast, in a child who'd had to start reading adults the way adults usually read each other. I meant it, Evelyn said, but it would have to be something your father agreed to. That's not a corner we can go around. Clara nodded slowly. She seemed to be doing calculations. He's better, Clara said after a moment. Since you came. He's still quiet. He's always quiet, but he's less. She searched for the word. Less gone. Evelyn didn't say anything to that. She picked up the bridle again. I'm just telling you, Clara said. I know. You can ignore it if you want. I'm not ignoring it. Clara seemed to find this satisfactory. She stayed for another hour, mostly quiet, occasionally asking questions, and when she left, she went out the side door instead of the front, and Evelyn didn't ask why, because she already knew. The side door couldn't be seen from Gruder's office window. She finished the tack work in the fading afternoon light and sat for a moment in the quiet of the stable, Ajax breathing in his stall, the other horses shifting and settling around her, and she thought about what Clara had said, less gone. And she thought about a man standing in a hallway outside his children's room, listening in the dark to someone else do the thing he couldn't figure out how to do himself. And she wasn't sure what she felt about any of it. It was too many things at once. She'd learned in the last 6 months that feelings didn't always separate into neat categories. Sometimes they were just a mass of something, complicated and unresolved and not going anywhere, and you just had to carry it around until it sorted itself out. She blew out the lantern and locked the stable and walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark. The story hit the bunkhouse on a Sunday, which Evelyn would later think was appropriate since Sunday was the only day everyone was sitting still long enough to really dig into it. She was mending her coat. The elbow, finally, she'd found a piece of wool that was close enough to the original color. When she heard Cass's voice from the other side of the partition wall, low and confidential, and with that particular quality of a person who wants to be overheard. Widow without a cent to her name, comes out here, starts spending nights in the main house. You tell me what that looks like. A pause. Denny's voice. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe. Or maybe she's smarter than she looks. Hale's been alone a year. He's grieving and not sleeping right. And he's got money and land and she's got nothing. Another pause. Women do this. It happens. She sat on her cot with the coat in her hands and the needle between her fingers, and she did not move. She does the work, Walt said. His voice was flatter than usual, more pointed. I haven't seen her slacking once. Nobody's saying she doesn't work. A pause. I'm saying there might be reasons beyond $8 a month. She put down the coat. She stood up. She went to the partition doorway. All four of them looked at her. Cass had the decency to look slightly caught, though he held her gaze. "I can hear you," she said. "It's a thin wall," Cass said. "I know." She kept her voice level. She was past the point of deciding how to handle this. She was just handling it, the way you handled things that needed handling. "I went to the main house once. Mr. Hale knows about it. The children were frightened. I settled them. That's the whole story." "That's your story," Cass said. "Cass," Walt's voice had an edge now. "I'm just saying what it looks like from the outside." "From the outside," Evelyn said, "it looks like a woman doing a job she was hired to do. If that doesn't fit the story you want to tell, I can't fix that." She looked at him steadily. "But I'd appreciate it if you'd tell your stories somewhere I can't hear them. It's not pleasant." She went back around the partition. She picked up the coat. She kept her hand steady on the needle, though her fingers wanted to shake, not from fear, but from the particular frustration of being in a situation that she couldn't argue her way out of, because the people she was arguing with had already decided what they believed. Shorty appeared around the partition 5 minutes later with a cup of coffee he hadn't asked if she wanted. "Here," he said. She took it. "Thank you." He leaned against the wall. For what it's worth, Walt told him to shut his mouth. Walt's a good man. "He is." Shorty drank his own coffee. "Cass isn't bad. He gets a thing in his head. I've met people like that." "Hasn't everyone?" He turned his cup in his hands. "It'll blow over." "Maybe," she said. She didn't believe it would. Not completely. This kind of thing, once it was in the air, it changed the air. You couldn't unbreathe it. But she didn't say that to Shorty because he was trying to be kind, and kindness deserved something back. So she said maybe, and she finished the mending, and she went to sleep. Colton Hale came to the stable the next morning. He came at 7, which was unusual. He typically did his rounds at midday, and he usually came through the paddock side, not the main door. He came through the main door and stood inside it for a moment while his eyes adjusted to the lantern light, and Evelyn, who was already halfway through the morning feeding, turned to look at him and waited. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the stalls, at the fresh bedding, at the tack she'd cleaned and hung back in order. He looked at Ajax, who had turned toward the door when it opened and was now watching him with the particular attention that, she'd noticed, the horse paid to very few people. "Gruder talked to you," he said finally. "He did. He talked to me too. This morning." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "He told me about what Cass has been saying. I'm aware. I want you to know that I've spoken to Cass." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that. You're working here. What you do on this ranch is my business." He said it like the logic was simple, though she could tell from the way he was standing that it had cost him something. Not a physically demonstrative man, not someone who went out of his way to get involved in the daily frictions of the bunkhouse. "I also want you to know, I haven't said anything to encourage that kind of speculation. About you and about you." She almost smiled. "I know. I haven't given anyone reason to think." He stopped. "Mr. Hale," she kept her voice even, "I don't believe you've behaved improperly. Nobody with any sense does." He looked at her with that measuring quality again. "Gruder thinks you should be let go." She'd half expected that. "I see. I'm not letting you go." He said it abruptly, like a decision he'd made and was announcing rather than discussing. "You're doing the job. You're good with the horses. Ajax hasn't been that—" He glanced at the roan. Something complicated crossed his face. "He hasn't been that settled in a year. He's a good horse. He's a difficult horse." A pause. "He was Margaret's. He's been difficult since she died." He said her name like he'd practiced saying it, deliberate, controlled, trying to make it just a name. "I know," Evelyn said. "You told me. In the note." Something shifted in his expression, like he'd forgotten he'd written that. "The children have been sleeping better," he said after a moment. "The last 2 weeks." She didn't say anything. "I haven't said anything to them about you coming in that night." He looked at the ground briefly, then back up at her. "But Clara told me. Independently." A pause. She told me you smell like horses and soap and that you sing wrong, but it still works. She stood with that for a moment. That's an accurate description. He almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way. It stopped somewhere around his eyes. I need to know, he said, that you're here because you want to work, nothing else. Because I've got enough to manage and I can't manage. He stopped again. He seemed to have more trouble finishing sentences in person than he did in writing. I just need to know that. She looked at him directly. I'm here because I needed work and a roof and $8 a month. That's the beginning and the end of it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the same decisive nod she was starting to recognize as his primary form of communication. Good, he said. He turned to go. At the stable door he stopped without turning back. The twins have been asking, he said, about coming to the stable again. She waited. I told them it was up to you. A pause. If you're willing. She thought about Henry on the overturned bucket asking about uncertainty and fear. She thought about Clara's coat buttoned wrong, coming through the side door so Gruder couldn't see. I'm willing, she said. He walked out into the morning and she watched him go. A tall man, broad-shouldered, moving with the particular careful weight of someone carrying something invisible, and she turned back to the horses. Ajax was watching the door where Colton had been standing. Even after he was gone, the roan kept looking, like he was expecting someone else to come through it. I know, she told him quietly. She went back to work. The storm came the way bad things often did on the frontier, with warning signs that everyone saw and nobody quite believed until it was too late to do much about them. 3 days before it hit, the sky went a particular shade of yellow-green in the late afternoon that made the horses restless. Evelyn noticed it first because she was always outside when the light changed, doing the evening feeding, and she stood in the stable doorway and looked at that sky for a long moment before she went back to work. She'd seen that color before, as a girl in Kansas, and she knew what it meant. She mentioned it to Walt that evening at dinner. Bad one coming, she said. Walt looked up from his plate. He'd lived on the plains his whole life, 40-odd years, and he had the kind of weather sense that lived in the joints and the back of the neck. He looked at her, and then looked at the window, even though it was dark and there was nothing to see. How bad? He asked. I don't know, but the horses are nervous. He nodded slowly. I'll talk to Gruder. Which Gruder, when Walt talked to him, did what Gruder did with things that inconvenienced his schedule. He acknowledged them minimally and then continued with his existing plans. There were cattle to move to the south pasture and a fence line to check on the eastern property, and he'd said he'd have both done by end of week, and end of week it would be. He'd been through storms before. So had Evelyn. That wasn't the point. She spent the next 2 days doing what she could with what she had. She double-checked all the stable latches and found 2 that were loose, which she fixed with hardware from the tool room. She moved extra hay inside the stable so they wouldn't have to go back and forth to the hayloft in bad conditions. She checked the water pipes again. She'd wrapped the vulnerable section with burlap weeks ago, but she added another layer. She looked at the split board she'd shimmed in stall 4 and decided it needed a real repair before heavy wind got into it, and she did that too, working until the light failed on the second evening, Walt holding the lantern for her while she drove nails into boards that didn't particularly want them. You know we might be wrong, Walt said. We might be, she agreed. She drove another nail. But if we're right, we'll be glad we did this. And if we're wrong, we just fixed a board that needed fixing anyway. He held the lantern steadier. Smart way to think about it. My mother's way. She said there's no such thing as preparing for nothing. You're always preparing for something. Your mother sounds like a woman worth knowing. She was. Evelyn straightened up and tested the board. Solid now, no flex. She died of a fever when I was 16, but she packed a lot of sense into those years. Walt didn't say he was sorry. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't say things that didn't mean anything. He just nodded and handed her the next nail, and they worked until the board was done. On the third day, the wind started. No, it wasn't immediately violent. It built the way a freight train built. You heard it first as a distant sound, then felt it as a vibration, and by the time you registered it as something to worry about, it was already very close. By mid-morning, the sky had gone from overcast to the kind of flat gray-black that made it feel like evening at 10 in the morning. and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours, and the first sleet was coming in horizontal off the northwest. Evelyn was in the stable when it hit in earnest. Not sleet anymore, but a proper wall of snow and wind that hit the stable walls with a sound like someone throwing gravel by the bucket. The horses reacted immediately. All of them, all at once, shifting and stamping and pushing at their stall doors, that nervous animal distress that was impossible to reason with and had to be managed one horse at a time. She worked through them. She kept her voice low and her movements deliberate, and she didn't rush because rushing was the worst thing you could do. Horses read human energy the way weather instruments read the air. Ajax was the worst of them. He'd gone back entirely to his first week behavior, hindquarters toward her, head down, and she had to spend 10 full minutes in his stall just standing at his shoulder, one hand laid flat on his neck before he stopped trembling. "I know," she said. "I know. It's loud. It's going to stay loud for a while, but you're inside and it can't get to you." She wasn't sure how much of that he understood. Probably not the words, but he turned toward her after a while, and that was enough. She was between stalls when she heard it over the wind, a sound that didn't belong, high and thin, coming from outside, from the direction of the main house. She went to the stable door and pulled it open 6 inches against the wind. It fought her, wanting to slam back, and she looked out into white chaos, snow driving sideways, visibility down to maybe 20 feet, and she heard it again. Children's voices. She was out of the stable before she'd made the decision. The wind hit her like something physical. Not a gust, but a sustained force, continuous pressure that wanted to push her sideways and wouldn't stop wanting. She got her arm up to shield her face and walked into it. "Henry! Clara!" The wind took her voice and threw it somewhere useless. She kept walking. She'd been on this ranch for 6 weeks, and she knew the layout in the dark, in the rain, by feel if necessary. 42 paces from the stable door to the well, then another 30 northeast to the main house's front porch. She counted. She kept her head down, and she counted. At 20 paces, she nearly walked into them. They were together, both of them, Clara with her arms wrapped around herself and her coat flapping open where the top button had already given up. Henry trying to hold her coat closed with one hand while using the other to hold on to the porch railing they'd apparently just come away from. They'd both been walking toward the stable, she realized, toward the light they'd been able to see from the house windows. And they'd gotten turned around in the white. "What are you doing out here?" she shouted over the wind. "The chimney?" Henry started. "Not now. Walk." She got between them and took one of each of their hands, and she turned them back toward the house. 40 paces, she told herself. She knew where she was. She'd counted. She took the 40 paces and she found the porch railing, and she pushed them both up the steps and through the front door, which someone had left unlatched, probably them, when they'd come out. Inside was warm air and the smell of smoke, and the sound of the wind raging against the house from outside. She pulled the door shut and dropped the bar across it and turned to look at them. Clara had ice in her hair. Henry's lips were going pale. They were both shaking, and from the expressions on their faces, she could tell it was 60% cold and 40% the particular shame of children who know they've done something dangerous and are trying to assess how much trouble they're in. "The chimney," Henry said again. "The upstairs chimney was making a noise like it was going to come apart. We couldn't find Mrs. Porter and Papa's out on the south pasture line with Gruder, and we didn't know—" "All right." She was already moving toward the stairs. "All right, come with me." The upstairs chimney was fine. The noise had been a cap piece working loose and banging in the wind, a problem, but not an immediate crisis. She pushed it back into place through the small attic access door that someone, Colton, she assumed, had built into the upper hallway ceiling. It took her 4 attempts to get it seated correctly because her hands were cold and clumsy and the access space was tight, and the whole time she could hear the storm working at the house from every direction at once. She got the cap secured and came down from the attic door and found the twins sitting side by side on the hallway floor outside it, watching her with matching expressions of careful attention. "Fixed," she said. "Just like that?" Henry said. It wasn't complicated. Just loose. She sat it down on the floor with them, her back against the hallway wall, because her legs were still shaking slightly from the cold outside, and she didn't want to stand on them anymore just yet. "Next time something makes a sound like that, you don't go outside to find help. You find Mrs. Porter or you wait. We couldn't find Mrs. Porter, Claire said. Then you wait. But what if… Henry, she looked at him directly. If something is actually on fire, you get out of the house and you go to the bunkhouse. You don't go looking for someone in a storm. Do you understand? He held her gaze for a moment, doing that thing he did where he weighed what he was being told against what he already thought. Then he nodded. Where did you learn to fix chimneys? Claire asked. I grew up fixing things. She leaned her head back against the wall. Outside the window at the end of the hallway, the storm was doing something complicated to the big cottonwood tree, branches waving in shapes that didn't look like branches should wave. My father didn't have anyone else. Where's he now? Claire asked. Gone. Long time ago. Like Mama, Claire said. Not a question, just placing it. Like your mama, Evelyn agreed. They sat together in the hallway while the storm moved through the house all around them. The sound of it was immense, not frightening quite, at this point, more like weather asserting its size. And in the middle of it, the three of them sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, not quite touching, but close. And Evelyn felt that same feeling she'd had in the stable that morning, that particular quality of calm that came from being in the right place at the right time, even when the right place was uncomfortable. After a while, Clara leaned against her shoulder. She didn't pull away. She just let it happen. Colton came back from the south pasture line 4 hours later, half frozen and furious. Not at her, she'd understand eventually, but at himself for being gone when he was needed. He came through the kitchen door and stopped when he found her at the stove with a pot of soup she'd started from what she could find in the larder, and both children at the kitchen table doing lessons neither of them were concentrating on. He looked at all of it for a moment. They went outside, Evelyn said, before he could ask. Looking for help because of the upstairs chimney, I found them about 20 feet from the porch. His face went through several things quickly. They're fine, she added. Cold, but fine. The chimney cap was loose. I fixed it. He looked at the twins. They looked back at him with the specific expression of children who knew they were going to have a conversation later and were making peace with that fact. Go upstairs, he said. Quiet. Controlled. Both of you. They went without argument, which told her they understood the tone. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after they were gone, facing the stove, and she could see his hands at his sides, fist briefly, then releasing. A man getting hold of himself. The south fence is down in 2 places, he said. His voice was even now, almost. We lost… He stopped. It doesn't matter. I can help with fencing tomorrow if the storm breaks. He turned to look at her. You can't do… I can drive fence posts, she said. I've done it before. You're going to need all the hands you can get. He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light was catching the ice that hadn't yet melted from his coat collar, and there were lines around his eyes that she didn't think were entirely from the cold. Why were you still in the house? He asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. I wasn't going to leave them here alone until the storm passed or someone came back. He turned back to the stove. He picked up the ladle from the pot and looked at it like he wasn't entirely sure why he was holding it. Then he set it down carefully. Thank you, he said. It was the second time he'd said it to her, and it came out the same way, like something extracted rather than given freely, not because he didn't mean it, but because meaning it required him to admit that he'd needed help, which was not a thing that came easily to him. Eat something, she said. There's enough. She left before he could respond to that, because the intimacy of the moment was starting to feel like something that needed air around it, and she went back to the stable to check on the horses in the storm's aftermath, and she stayed there longer than she needed to. What happened next happened in town, which she heard about secondhand. Cutter's Creek was a day's ride in good weather, half a day if you pushed it, and most of the business that connected Black Ridge Ranch to the town, supplies, mail, occasional legal matters, went through Gruder, who made the trip every 2 to 3 weeks. He went 4 days after the storm, when the road had been cleared enough to make it possible, and when he came back his face had a particular set to it that Shorty, who noticed faces in the way that some people noticed weather, described later as the look of a man who'd heard something that confirmed what he already believed. She heard about it from Walt, who'd been in the barn when Gruder came back and had the particular skill, developed over decades, of being present and inconspicuous in the same moment. He talked to someone in town, Walt said. They were at the paddock fence, both leaning on the top rail, watching the horses get their first real time outside in a week. His voice was low, not conspiratorial, just careful. Reverend Marsh's wife. I don't know who that is. She's a woman who knows things and tells them widely. Walt turned a piece of bark over in his hands. She told Gruder that there's talk in town, about you and Mr. Hale. He paused. Specific talk, that there's something between you, that you've been seen in the house after dark, that the twins have been kept away from their father and replaced with an attachment to you. She kept her eyes on the horses. Ajax was moving along the far fence line, and she watched him the way she always watched him, looking for the hitch in his left hind that showed up when the temperature dropped, and she kept her breathing steady. Where did that come from? She asked. I think you know. She did. She thought about Cass's voice through the partition wall. She thought about the particular way rumors spread in isolated places. Not like fire, which burned fast and obvious, but like groundwater, finding the low spots, moving under things, showing up somewhere unexpected, and then being impossible to trace back to the source. What else? She asked. Walt hesitated. That told her there was more. She said, Mrs. Marsh said that some in town think Mr. Hale should be protected from a woman who came with nothing and has worked her way into the house and the family, that he's still grieving and not thinking clearly. A pause. She used the word scheming. The word landed with a specific kind of weight. Not surprising. She'd been half expecting something like this since the night Shorty had warned her about Cass. But expected and landed were different things. You could know a punch was coming and still feel it. What does Gruder intend to do about it? She asked. Talk to Mr. Hale, Walt said. He already has, I think, this morning. She pushed off the fence. All right. Evelyn? Walt said her name for the first time since she'd arrived, and it surprised her enough that she stopped. I want you to know, and I told Mr. Hale the same, that I've watched you work every day since you got here, and I've never seen anything that looked like scheming. What I've seen is a woman doing a hard job in hard conditions and doing it right. He turned the piece of bark over again. I'm not a man with a lot of influence, but I said it to him and I'll say it wherever else it needs saying. She stood for a moment with that. Frontier life, she'd always known this, had known it since childhood, was mostly transactional. People helped each other because they had to, because survival in this landscape was collective, whether you liked it or not. Real decency, the kind that didn't ask for anything back, was rarer than people like to pretend. Walt was rare. Thank you, she said. That means something. He waved it off with the piece of bark and went back to watching the horses. Gruder came to her that afternoon. She'd been prepared for it, which didn't make it easier. He stood inside the stable door. He always stood inside the stable door, she'd noticed, like he was making sure there was a clear path back out. And he looked at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was executing it and didn't particularly like the execution. You should know that there's been talk in town, he said. I know. He looked slightly wrong-footed by that. Walt, she confirmed. She kept working, oiling a saddle, the same mechanical task, because it helped her to keep her hands doing something. Say what you came to say, Mr. Gruder. He set his jaw. I told Mr. Hale that the situation has become difficult, that your presence here has created a problem that is affecting the ranch's reputation and his family's reputation in the community. He said it with the cadence of something rehearsed. I advised him to let you go, before the season. And what did he say? A pause, and in the pause she could read the whole shape of the conversation he'd had with Colton. The frustration, the pushback, the outcome he hadn't wanted. He said no, Gruder said. She set down the saddlecloth. She turned to look at him. So you're here to tell me what he said? I'm here to tell you that my advice was refused and to make clear to you that... He stopped, started again. That I will be watching, that anything that looks improper, anything that gives me cause, and I'll bring it to him again. That seems like you're right, she said. He looked at her. Some of the prepared quality had gone out of his expression now. He looked like what he probably was underneath the foreman role. A man in his 50s who'd been loyal to one family for a long time and was afraid of what change would cost them. "He's a good man," Gruder said. It came out without the rehearsed quality, just a fact. "I know he is," she said. She was a good woman. He said it like he wasn't entirely sure he meant to. Margaret, they were right for each other, the two of them. I never thought something like that could be replaced, and I'm not. He stopped again. "I'm not saying that's what you're trying to do. I'm saying that's what it looks like. To the town. To some people on this ranch." "I understand," she said. He nodded once, the same decisive nod she'd seen in Colton, and she thought that was probably not a coincidence. A man who'd worked for another man long enough would pick up his gestures like a second language. He left, and she went back to the saddle, and she thought about appearances and what they cost, and she thought about a woman named Margaret Hale who had been right for someone and was gone. And she thought about herself, who she was, what she was actually doing here, the true answer to that question below all the practical answers she'd given everyone else. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd only really let herself think at night, on the cot, in the dark. She was here because she needed to be somewhere. She was here because she'd needed work and a roof. She was here because Lily was gone and Thomas was gone and Kansas was a place she couldn't breathe anymore. And she'd followed an advertisement to the edge of the world because it had pointed away from everything she'd lost. And now, 6 weeks in, she was also here because Ajax knew her footstep and turned toward the door when he heard her coming. Because Henry asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. Because Clara leaned against her shoulder in a hallway during a storm. And she had let it happen, and it had felt. Not like replacing something lost. Not that. Something different. Something that didn't have a clean name but was real, in the way that the cold was real, and the work was real, and the particular color of an angry prairie sky was real. She wasn't scheming, she was surviving. And somewhere in the surviving she had started to live, a little, again. She wasn't sure that was anyone else's business. The kidnapping happened on a Tuesday. She would replay it afterward, trying to find the moment where she should have seen it coming, and she never quite could. Not because the warning signs weren't there, they were, in retrospect, but because they'd hidden themselves inside ordinary things, the way serious danger often did. The man who'd been coming to the ranch for the past 2 weeks was named Hollis Crane. He introduced himself as a land assessor out of the county seat, doing routine property surveys on behalf of the territorial government. He was well dressed for the frontier, with a clean coat and decent boots, and a way of speaking that suggested education, or at least the performance of it. Gruder had dealt with him, showed him the boundary markers, gave him access to the property records he requested, answered his questions about acreage and water rights in the eastern fence line. All routine. She'd noticed him twice. Once because Ajax had watched him with the flat, specific attention the horse reserved for things he'd already decided he didn't like. Once because she'd caught him looking at the main house in a way that had nothing to do with land assessment, calculating, patient, the look of someone taking inventory. She hadn't said anything. She wasn't sure what she would have said exactly. The horse doesn't like him. Didn't seem like something Gruder would find persuasive. On Tuesday morning, she came back from the stable after the 6 o'clock feeding and found the main house door standing open. She walked across the yard. She knocked on the open door and called in. Nothing. She went inside and went up the stairs and looked in the twins' room and found 2 beds, unmade, with the particular unease of beds that had been left quickly rather than normally. Clara's ragdoll was on the floor by the door, which Clara never left on the floor. She went back downstairs. Mrs. Porter hadn't arrived yet. She came at 7. The kitchen was cold, fire not yet built up, which meant no one had been in it since the night before. She went back outside and around to the back of the house and found, in the mud near the woodpile, boot prints. Multiple sets, adult-sized and 2 sets that were smaller, and the smaller sets had the dragging quality of people who were being moved rather than walking on their own. She stood with that for a moment. The cold air came in and went out of her lungs, and she stood very still and let what she was looking at register completely, because the impulse was to run somewhere, but she didn't know where to run yet, and running in the wrong direction would cost time she didn't have. She went to find Colton. He was at the south barn, already up and working on the fence repair from the storm damage. She came around the corner at a pace that wasn't quite a run, because she didn't want to waste breath on speed she couldn't maintain, and he looked up from the post he was setting and read something in her face that made him put down the post driver before she said a word. "The children are gone," she said. She watched him process that, watched him go through the same thing she'd just gone through. The instinct to move immediately, fighting with the understanding that moving wrong was worse than waiting 2 more minutes to move right. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him. The door, the room, the doll, the boot prints. He listened without interrupting, and she could see him doing what she'd done, building the picture, finding the shape of it. "Crane," he said. "I think so." "The eastern property," he said. He was asking about the eastern acreage specifically, water rights. He was already moving back toward the main barn, walking fast. "I have papers he doesn't want filed. Boundary records that would dispute a claim he's made with the territorial office." He said it with the clipped efficiency of a man who is holding fear at arm's length with both hands and using the practical to do it. "This isn't random." "No," she agreed. "Gruder," he said, "tell me where you need me." He stopped walking and looked at her. It was brief. They didn't have time for anything else. But it was real, that look. He wasn't telling her to go back to the stable. He wasn't telling her to wait. "Can you ride fast?" he asked. "Yes." "I need someone who can stay with me and not fall behind." He was already moving again. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. She meant it. She'd grown up on horseback, and she'd ridden hard ground, and she'd done it without saddle before, and she could do it now. She could keep up. She would keep up. They saddled fast. Colton on his own horse, a big, dark bay. Evelyn on the gray gelding who had the best endurance of the horses she'd been caring for. And Colton sent one of the hands for Gruder while they readied. Gruder arrived at the barn door just as they were mounting, out of breath, his face doing something complicated when he saw Evelyn on the gelding. "She stays here," Gruder said. "She found them. She knows the signs." Colton swung up. "She rides." Gruder looked at Evelyn. She looked back. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "Northeast," Colton said. "The Crane camp has to be northeast. There's shelter in the ridgeback draws and a road to the territorial line. That's where they'd go." He looked at Gruder. "Bring Walt and Shorty. Take the south track in case I'm wrong. Stay within signal distance." Gruder nodded. One of the decisive nods, not his own this time, just borrowed. They rode out. Was it? The ridgeback draws were 7 miles northeast, a series of shallow limestone canyons cut by old water into the rolling plains, full of cedar scrub and sheltered pockets where a man could make a camp that couldn't be seen from the ridgeline above. Evelyn had never been there, but Colton knew every fold of the land on his own property, and he rode with the certainty of someone navigating by memory, adjusting course twice without explanation in ways that the terrain justified when she caught up to where he was looking. They rode hard for the first 3 miles, and then slower through the cedar, because horses in dense scrub made noise, and they needed to hear what was ahead of them before what was ahead of them heard them. Colton pulled up on the ridgeline above the first draw, and they sat for a moment in the cold air, listening. Horses. 2 horses, staked somewhere below and to the east. The sounds of a camp. He looked at her. She nodded. They left the horses tied on the north face where the wind would carry scent away from Crane's animals, and they went down on foot through the cedar, which was the kind of cover that made noise under boots no matter how careful you were. She stepped where he stepped and kept her breathing quiet, and the cold air burned in her throat. She heard Clara first. Not crying. Clara wasn't crying, and she'd expected that from Clara somehow, that the girl would be past the crying and into the angry quiet by the time anyone found her. She heard Clara's voice, small and controlled. "You said you wouldn't tie them that tight." A man's voice, which she didn't recognize, dismissive. "Sit down." She said they were tight. "Henry, sit down." Henry's voice then, and the sound of it made something tighten in her chest, because he was trying to be steady, trying to be the older sibling even now, even scared and tied up in a canyon in the cold. She touched Colton's arm. He'd already stopped. He was looking through the cedar at the camp below. A fire, 2 men, the twins sitting back to back against a boulder with their hands behind them. A third man, Hollis Crane, standing near the fire with a tin cup and his back to the cedar wall where they were standing. 2 other men, armed, Colton had a rifle. She had the hunting knife she'd taken from the tack room on impulse, which was either going to be useful or wasn't going to matter. He turned to her, and his expression was absolutely clear. He had no hesitation in his face at all, no uncertainty, just the specific calm of a man who had made a decision about what he was willing to do and had fully committed to it. She understood that expression because she was wearing it herself. He handed her the rifle. She looked at him. "You're a better shot from distance," he said. It was a guess. He didn't know that, but she didn't correct it because the rifle was the right choice. She could fire if she had to. He needed his hands free for what he was going to do next, which was walk into that camp. "Wait until I'm in position," he said, "then follow." She took the rifle. He walked down through the last of the cedar and into the camp like he owned it, which technically he did, it being his land, and the effect of his sudden appearance was immediate and satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with elegance. All three men swung toward him, Crane's cup hitting the ground, and the twins' heads both came up, and Clara made a sound she would probably deny later. "Papa," Henry said, flat with relief, trying to sound like it wasn't the best thing he'd ever said. "Mr. Hale." Crane found his composure faster than the other two. "I can explain. You're on my land with my children," Colton said. He kept walking, slow and steady, toward the center of the camp. "I don't need an explanation. I need you to tell your men to step back." "Or what?" one of the armed men said. Evelyn stepped out of the cedar with the rifle leveled. "Or that," Colton said. What happened next was not clean. It was not the kind of standoff that resolved itself neatly, with men raising their hands and stepping back in order. One of the armed men went for his gun, and she fired, above his head, because the shot she was trying to make and the shot her hands made in the cold weren't the same shot, and the bullet went higher than she'd intended. And it didn't matter because the sound of it was enough. He stopped. The other one stopped. Crane ran. He went for the horses, and Colton went after him. And what happened between the boulder and the tied horses was neither graceful nor prolonged. It was two men in frozen mud and cedar scrub, and it ended with Crane face down in Colton's knee and his back. And it wasn't dignified, and it wasn't how it looked in the stories people told about frontier justice. It was just fast and functional and final. She was already at the boulder, knife out, cutting the rope off Clara's wrists. "You came," Clara said. Her voice was entirely steady. Her hands, when freed, were shaking. "We came," Evelyn said. "I told Henry you'd come." She said it with a 7-year-old's fierce vindication. "He said we should wait in case nobody noticed until morning. I said you'd notice. You notice everything." "Henry was right to be cautious," Evelyn said. She moved to his wrists. "And you were right that we'd come. Both things can be true." Henry, freed, turned around and looked at her. His face was the face of someone who'd been holding a thing together from the inside and was now deciding whether it was safe to put it down. She recognized it. She'd worn it herself. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when we're back on a horse and headed home." Gruder and the others arrived 20 minutes later, which was 10 minutes after Crane was already trussed with his own rope, and the two hired men had decided that this situation had not been what they'd agreed to and were cooperating with impressive enthusiasm. Gruder came down the cedar slope and stopped at the edge of the camp and looked at all of it. Crane on the ground, the hired men sitting against the boulder, the twins beside the fire that Evelyn had rebuilt because they were cold, Colton standing in the middle of it all like he'd arranged it on purpose. And something shifted in Gruder's face that she couldn't quite name. He looked at her last. He looked at her for a long moment. At the rifle still in her hands, at Clara who was sitting pressed against her side with the absolute unselfconsciousness of a child who had decided exactly where they wanted to be. And she looked back at him and waited. He didn't say anything. He looked away. He started organizing the practical things. Which horses could carry which people, how they were going to move Crane back to the ranch. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. They rode back in the early afternoon light, the storm's aftermath still white across the plains, and the sky had gone from the angry yellow-green of 3 days ago to a clean, clear blue that had nothing to apologize for. Clara rode in front of Colton, her head against his chest, asleep by the second mile. The specific sleep of a child who'd been holding themselves together for a long time and finally didn't have to anymore. Henry rode with Shorty and talked the whole way, asking questions about the ranch and the storm damage and whether Ajax had been all right during the kidnapping, and Shorty answered all of them. Evelyn rode the gray gelding and let the ground move under her and felt the cold in her face and her hands and the specific ache in her ribs from where she'd hit the cedar trunk harder than she'd intended on the way down the slope, and she thought, this is what you came here with nothing for. Not the wages, not the roof. This specific morning, this specific gallop home across frozen ground, those two children alive. She thought about Lily, briefly, the way she sometimes did after something important happened. Not with the old drowning grief, but with something quieter and more bearable. Like a hand she was still holding even though the person was gone. Like a compass she still carried, even though she didn't need to look at it to know which way was north. She knew which way was north. She rode. They brought Hollis Crane back to Black Ridge Ranch tied across his own horse, which was undignified and probably uncomfortable and entirely appropriate. The two hired men rode ahead of him with Gruder and Walt on either side, and nobody spoke much on the return because there wasn't anything that needed saying yet. The time for talking would come, and when it did, there would be plenty of it, but the ride home was not that time. The ride home was for getting back. Cutter's Creek had a sheriff. His name was Aldous Briggs, and he was a man of about 60 who had been doing the job for 20 years and had the particular combination of world weariness and fundamental stubbornness that the job required. Gruder sent Shorty ahead to fetch him before they'd even gotten the horses unsaddled, and Briggs arrived at Black Ridge Ranch by mid-afternoon on a horse that looked as tired as he did. He took statements from everyone. He took them separately, methodically, sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pencil he sharpened twice during the process. He talked to Colton first, then Gruder, then Walt and Shorty. He talked to Henry, who gave a precise and detailed account that Evelyn could hear from the hallway and which impressed her in the way that Henry regularly impressed her. Not because it was the account of a brave child, but because it was the account of an observant one. He talked to Clara, who was less precise and considerably more furious, and who described Hollis Crane in terms that made Briggs blink once before he wrote them down. Then he came to Evelyn. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. She'd moved back to the kitchen by this point, keeping herself out of the center of things, making coffee and keeping the fire up because it was something useful to do. He looked at her with the flat, experienced eyes of a man who had spent 2 decades reading people across small tables and had developed opinions about what those readings were worth. "You're the stable hand," he said. "Yes." "You were the one who found the boot prints." "Yes." "And you rode out with Mr. Hale." "Yes." He looked at his notebook. "You fired the rifle." "I fired above the man. I was trying to stop him from drawing." "Did you hit anything?" "A cedar branch, about 4 feet above his head." Briggs looked up from the notebook. "Intentional?" She held his gaze. "The shot I intended was closer to 2 feet. My hands were cold." He studied her for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration of some kind. "You said you fired above him. Other witnesses say the same." "Because that's what happened." He made a note. "Tell me about Crane's previous visits to the ranch." She told him everything she remembered. The 2 times she'd seen him, Ajax's reaction, the look she'd caught him directing at the main house. She told it plainly, in order, without embellishment, and when she was done, Briggs read back his notes, and she confirmed them. "You noticed the way the horse reacted to him," Briggs said. "Ajax is particular about people. He'd made up his mind about Crane. And you believed the horse." "I didn't disbelieve him." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't tell what he was deciding. Then he closed his notebook and set his pencil down on top of it. "There's been talk in town," he said, "about you." "I'm aware. I've heard some of it." He said it without apology, just statement. "Mrs. Marsh has opinions that she shares freely. So I understand. I'm going to tell you something that Mrs. Marsh would not appreciate me telling you." He leaned back slightly in the chair, a man settling into a position he'd already decided on. "In 20 years of doing this job, I have looked across a table at people who were running a scheme and people who weren't. The ones who will always have something to account for. Some detail that doesn't fit, some piece of the story that's a little too clean. He picked up the pencil again and looked at it. Your story has no clean pieces. You didn't find those boot prints at a convenient time. You went out in that storm without knowing for certain what you'd find. You fired a bad shot with cold hands. Those are not the details of someone performing a role. He stood. I just wanted you to know that. She sat for a moment after he left the kitchen. She listened to him walk back down the hallway, heard him say something to Colton that she couldn't make out, heard the front door. Then she got up and refilled her coffee cup and went back to being useful. Crane was taken to the county jail that evening. The charges, as Briggs explained them before he left, were substantial. Trespassing, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, because the land scheme had come out in full. Briggs having apparently known about Hollis Crane from a previous county where similar things had occurred. Crane had been working a particular fraud across territorial properties for several years, identifying land with disputed eastern boundaries and manufacturing claims that he'd then sell to investors in the East who never came to verify. He'd needed Colton's boundary records destroyed or discredited. The twins had been, in his calculation, leverage. The calculation had been wrong, but Evelyn understood intellectually why he'd made it. A grieving man, 2 young children, a property dispute that could tie up land rights for years. It must have looked workable from the outside. What Crane had not calculated was Colton Hale, specifically. A man who grieved quietly and moved slowly and arrived when you least expected him with absolute certainty about what he was willing to do. What he'd also not calculated was her. She didn't think about that for very long because thinking about it made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't entirely explain. So she put it away and concentrated on the practical things that needed doing, which were numerous in the aftermath of a storm and a kidnapping and a sheriff's visit all in the same week. The practical things were, in some ways, a relief. Boss. The change in Gruder came slowly, the way changes in people who had built their positions carefully always did. Not a single moment, but a series of small readjustments, each one almost invisible, that accumulated into something you could finally name. The first readjustment was the morning after Crane was taken away, when Gruder came to the stable at his usual 7 o'clock and found her already through the feeding and working on the water pipe wrap she'd been meaning to reinforce since the storm. He stood inside the door for the usual moment. Then, instead of saying what he usually said, the flat professional acknowledgement, nothing more, he said, "The pipe on the south wall of the bunkhouse is the same risk. If you have time." She looked at him. "I'll get to it today." He nodded and left. It wasn't an apology. She didn't think Gruder was a man who apologized easily or frequently, and she didn't need him to be. What it was, instead, was an acknowledgement. A small, practical acknowledgement that she was competent, that her presence here was functional and useful, that the south bunkhouse pipe needed attention, and she was the person he was asking to attend to it. That was enough. That was more than enough from a man like Gruder. She did the south bunkhouse pipe that afternoon. It took an hour, and when she was done, she found he'd left a cup of coffee on the bunkhouse step, which could have been a coincidence. She chose to take it as what it probably was. The second readjustment happened 4 days after the rescue, when she was in the yard splitting wood. The storm had taken out a section of the woodpile cover, and wet wood was worse than no wood, so she was working through the dry interior stack to bring it into the covered section before the next cold snap. And Cass came out of the barn and stood for a moment watching her, and then, without saying anything, picked up the second axe from the block and started working the other half of the stack. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. Then Cass set his axe down and picked up the piece he'd just split and looked at it. "I don't think you were scheming," he said. He said it like a man putting down something heavy he'd been carrying. "I said it because I was looking for an explanation that made more sense to me than a woman coming out here on her own for $8 a month. But that was..." He paused. "That was my problem, not yours." She stacked the piece she was holding and reached for the next. "All right," she said. "That's all you're going to say?" "What do you want me to say?" He thought about it. "I don't know. Something more." "I spent 6 weeks on this ranch being talked about in ways that weren't accurate," she said. "I'm not going to pretend that felt like nothing, but I'm also not going to hold it over you for the rest of winter." She picked up the axe. "The stack needs doing." He picked up his axe. They finished the stack. The third readjustment, The one that surprised her most, because she'd least expected it from this particular direction, was Walt, who came to her not to make an adjustment, but to acknowledge that he'd been waiting for one. He found her at the paddock fence on a quiet afternoon, the horses moving in the low winter sun, and he leaned on the fence beside her and looked at the horses for a while before he said anything. "When you first got here," he said, "I told myself I was staying out of it, whatever it was going to turn into. I'd seen women come to frontier ranches before, as cooks mostly, or to marry someone, and it always went sideways one way or another, and I didn't want to be involved." He paused. "That wasn't right. I should have said something sooner, to Gruder, to Cass. I had more standing than I used." "You spoke up when it mattered," she said. "Not enough. Not early enough." She thought about saying something reassuring. She decided he deserved the truth more than the reassurance. "No," she said, "not early enough. But you did eventually, and that mattered, and most people don't even get there." He nodded slowly. "You're harder to comfort than most people." "I've been told that." "Is that your way of saying you don't need comforting?" "It's my way of saying I'd rather have the truth than a soft version of it." She turned to look at him. "You're a good man, Walt. You were trying to be fair from the beginning. Fair and quick aren't always the same thing." He seemed to sit with this until it settled. Then he nodded again, and they watched the horses, and that was sufficient. What she hadn't expected, what no part of her had been prepared for, was the town. Cutter's Creek was a day's ride, and she had no reason to go there, and hadn't been since she'd arrived. But Cutter's Creek, apparently, had reasons to come to her. It started with Mrs. Aldous Briggs, the sheriff's wife, who arrived at Blackridge Ranch on a Thursday morning in a wagon driven by her son, with a covered dish and an expression that suggested she'd made a decision and was executing it without apology. She knocked at the main house door, not the bunkhouse, and Evelyn happened to be crossing the yard when it happened, and she watched Mrs. Briggs hand the covered dish to Colton and say something she couldn't hear, and Colton looked surprised, and Mrs. Briggs looked like a woman who had said what she came to say and was satisfied. On her way back to the wagon, she stopped where Evelyn was standing. "Mrs. Cross," she said. "Ma'am." She was a compact woman, 60s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something better. Character, the particular quality of a face that had done a lot of living and not tried to hide it. "My husband told me what you did," she said. "He doesn't tell me much about his work. When he does, I pay attention." She looked at Evelyn with the direct assessment of a woman who had long since stopped having the patience for anything else. "There are people in town who have said unkind things about you." "I know." "Some of those people are my friends." She said it without embarrassment. "I've told them they were wrong. I wanted you to know that." Evelyn stood for a moment with that. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not doing it for you, particularly. I'm doing it because being wrong in public is bad for everyone, and someone has to say so." But there was something in the way she said it, a slight softening at the end, that suggested this was more than civic principle. "You're doing good work out here. That matters." She got back in the wagon. Her son clicked at the horse, and they went back down the road, and Evelyn stood in the yard for a moment afterward, feeling something she couldn't immediately categorize. Not vindication exactly, because she hadn't been waiting for it the way she might have once. More like the particular relief of finding out that the world was not entirely composed of the worst version of people, that there were Walts and Mrs. Briggses distributed throughout it, doing small corrective things without fanfare. Other people came over the following 2 weeks in ones and twos. Some came to see Colton on business. The aftermath of Crane's arrest had stirred up attention, and there were legal matters related to the land boundary records that required various people to make various trips. But some of them came specifically to see the ranch, to see how things were at Blackridge, and some of them found occasions to speak to Evelyn briefly, in the yard or near the stable, with the slightly awkward quality of people performing a correction they'd decided was overdue. She was not gracious about all of it. She was honest about this with herself. Some of the people who came with their small olive branches and their new revised opinions were people who had, in Cutter's Creek's parlor rooms and church halls, said things that had made her situation here substantially harder than it needed to be. Forgiving that entirely and immediately was not something she was capable of, and she didn't perform it. She was polite. She was civil. She did not make it easy, and she did not feel guilty for not making it easy. What she did feel, underneath all of it, was something that took her a while to identify because she hadn't felt it in so long. It was something like standing upright, not triumphant, not that, just upright. The specific posture of a person who had been doubted and proven and was still standing, still working, still exactly who they'd been when they arrived, no more and no less. The conversation with Colton happened on a night in December, 3 weeks after the rescue, when the cold had settled in for what felt like the permanent variety, and the stars were the particular sharp-edged kind you only got when the air was completely dry and frozen. She'd been in the stable late. Ajax had been favoring his left hind again, and she'd wanted to watch him move before she decided whether to call for the farrier. And when she came out, Colton was sitting on the paddock fence in the dark, which was not where she'd expected him to be at 9 in the evening. She stopped. Something wrong? No. He didn't look at her. He was looking at the stars, or the ground, or something in the middle distance that wasn't either. I couldn't sleep. I came out. She stood for a moment in the stable doorway, cold air moving against her face, debating whether this was the kind of moment she should walk away from. She decided it wasn't. She went to the fence and leaned against the post nearest to him and looked up at the same stars he wasn't quite looking at. They were quiet for a while. It was the kind of quiet she'd come to understand was not empty. Colton Hale's silences had content to them. They were full of things he was working out, and she'd learned over the past 2 months to let them be what they were rather than trying to fill them. The county office confirmed the boundary records this week, he said finally. Crane's claim is voided. Good. The eastern acreage is clear. He paused. It's good land. Margaret wanted to put cattle on it. I kept putting it off. Another pause. I'm going to do it in the spring. She nodded. I've been putting a lot of things off, he said. He said it like a confession he hadn't fully intended to make, like it had come out a sentence ahead of where he'd thought he was. Since she died, I kept thinking that if I just maintained things, if I kept everything exactly the way it was, I could. He stopped. I don't know what I thought. It didn't make sense even when I was doing it. Grief doesn't require sense, she said. He looked at her then, sideways briefly. No. It just requires time, she said. And even then, it doesn't go away. It just gets parallel, like it's running alongside you instead of through you. He was quiet. Then, is that what it's like for you? She thought about Thomas. She thought about Lily. She thought about the way she could go whole days now without the drowning feeling, and then something would happen. A particular smell, a sound, a sleeping child's face, and it would be right there again, immediate and enormous. Most days, she said, not every day. He nodded. He turned back to the dark. What you did, he said. For them. Not just in the canyon. Before that. The nights. The stable. The way you... He stopped again. He had that quality of a man whose thoughts were fully formed but whose words were always slightly behind them, working to catch up. They're different. Since you came. Clara doesn't have as many headaches. Henry laughs more. He stopped. I'm not saying that like it's a small thing. I want you to understand that I know it's not a small thing. She stood with the post at her back and the cold moving across the paddock, and she felt the weight of what he was saying, what he was trying to say. And she also felt her own instinct, the careful 6 months widowed instinct, pushing back against it gently. Not denying it, just placing it carefully, the way you place something fragile. They're easy to love, she said. Your children, they're remarkable, actually. Henry will argue with anyone about anything if he thinks he's right. And Clara knows things she shouldn't know yet and pretends she doesn't. And they're both... She paused. They're both going to be fine. They're built right. You had a child, he said. She'd told him, she realized obliquely, in pieces, in the way that things came out over months of daily proximity. Not a full telling. She'd never given a full telling to anyone here. But enough pieces that the shape of it was visible. A girl, she said. Lily. She was 4 months old. He was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him deciding what to do with that. Whether to say he was sorry, which seemed inadequate, or to say nothing, which might seem dismissive, and she watched him navigate the same territory she'd made other people navigate with Thomas and find the same lack of clear road through it. What was she like? He asked. She looked at him. That was not the question most people asked. Most people asked what happened or when, or the practical questions that kept the conversation in the safe territory of facts. She took a breath. She had Thomas's ears, she said, which sounds like a small thing, but I thought about it constantly because he had these very particular ears, and she had them exactly. And she was a serious baby. She didn't smile for a long time, and then when she finally did, it was like the whole room changed. She stopped. Her voice was still steady. That was new, relatively new, the steadiness while talking about it. She had 3 months and 3 weeks. That was all she got. He didn't say he was sorry. He said, "She sounds like she was Clara's kind of person." And that specific thing, that exact right thing, was what undid her. Not dramatically, not with the old drowning grief, but quietly, in the way that kindness sometimes undid her when she wasn't prepared for it. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment and looked at the stars and breathed through it. "Yeah," she said when she could. "She was." They stood in the cold for a while longer, not touching, the fence between them and the dark all around, and the stars doing their indifferent, beautiful thing overhead. She didn't feel the need to fill the silence after that, and neither did he, and eventually she said she should check on Ajax one more time before she turned in, and he said goodnight, and she went back into the warm dark of the stable. Ajax was standing in his stall. He turned toward her when she came in without waiting, without the old suspicion, just a horse turning toward a person he decided was his. She stood with her hand on his neck for a long time. What happened in Cutter's Creek happened publicly, which she understood was the point. It was a Saturday, the first Saturday of December, which was when the town held its monthly gathering in the feed hall, a practical event that had evolved from a trading post into something more social. Colton went because there was business to do, land records to finalize with the county clerk who kept an office in the back of the feed hall, and Evelyn went because Colton had said, in the direct way he said things, that she should come. She hadn't argued. She'd understood what it meant even before they got there. The feed hall was warm and crowded and smelled like sawdust and coffee and too many people in wool coats. She'd worn her best dress, which wasn't very impressive, but was clean and properly mended and was what she had. She was aware immediately of being looked at, the specific quality of a room's attention when it turns toward a new variable. She'd felt it before many times, and she knew how to stand inside it, straight, unhurried, looking back without either aggression or apology. She saw Mrs. Marsh from across the room. The Reverend's wife was a tall woman, with the upright quality of someone who had long considered their posture a moral statement. She looked at Evelyn with an expression that was doing several things at once, reassessing, recalculating, and not entirely comfortable with either process. Evelyn held her gaze for a moment and then moved on, because that was all that was needed. Colton handled the business at the county clerk's office with 2 other men. The boundary records, formal and final now, Crane's fraudulent claim documented and dismissed. She waited near the coffee urn and talked to Mrs. Briggs, who had come in from the other end of the hall and who greeted her with the plain warmth of a woman who had already made her decisions and wasn't revisiting them. "How are the twins?" Mrs. Briggs asked. "Good. Henry is working through his father's surveying books. Clara has decided she wants to learn to sew." "And are you teaching her?" She paused. That was still a delicate thing. The shape of what she was to the twins, what permission she'd been given and what she'd taken, and whether those were the same. "Working on it," she said carefully. Mrs. Briggs looked at her with the direct, experienced look she'd deployed in the ranch yard. "You're being careful," she said. "I'm trying to be appropriate." There's a difference between careful and appropriate. She poured herself coffee. Appropriate is doing the right thing. Careful is worrying too much about how it looks. She handed Evelyn a cup. "Stop being careful. You've already shown this town who you are." It was then that she heard Colton's voice, raised, which was unusual enough to make her head turn. He was standing near the center of the room, and the county clerk was beside him, and a small cluster of people had gathered, and she could see from his posture that he'd said something and was about to say something else and didn't particularly care who heard it. "I want to be clear," he said. His voice had the carrying quality of a man used to making himself heard across outdoor distances. About what happened at my ranch this fall, about what this woman, he didn't gesture toward her, but she felt the room's attention swing in her direction anyway. What Evelyn Cross did for my family. The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms went quiet when someone started saying something that mattered. There were stories, he said. I heard them. Some of you told them to people who told them to Pete Gruder, who told them to me. Stories about why she was really at my ranch, what she was really after. He paused, not for dramatic effect. She could see he was simply finding the words, which didn't come easily to him in public any more than they did in private. Those stories were wrong. I want to say that plainly, in this room, so nobody can say they didn't hear it from me directly. She stood near the coffee urn, and she didn't look at the floor, and she didn't look at the ceiling. She looked at him, because he was the one talking, and he deserved to be looked at. She came to Black Ridge Ranch with nothing, he said. She came because she needed work. She worked. She worked harder than people who'd been there for years, and she did it without... He stopped. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was dealing with something he hadn't fully prepared for. Without asking for anything she hadn't been offered. And when my children needed someone, when I wasn't enough on my own, she was there. Not because it served her, because she's the kind of person who hears children crying in the dark and can't walk away from it. He looked around the room. I would ask that this community remember that, because it's the truth, and the truth in this case is considerably better than the stories. The silence lasted a moment longer. Then the county clerk, a dry, practical man who spoke perhaps 4 sentences per social occasion, said, "Sounds about right to me," and went back to his documents, and the room exhaled, and people began to talk again. She stood by the coffee urn. Mrs. Briggs, beside her, was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who had expected something like this and was satisfied that it had arrived. She was not the same woman who had stepped off a wagon in front of a timber gate 6 weeks earlier. She knew that. She'd been taking stock of it recently, quietly, in the early mornings in the stable, the ways she'd changed and the ways she hadn't, the things she'd lost before she came here that would never come back, and the things that had, slowly and without announcing themselves, begun to fill some of the space those losses had left. Not the same shape, never the same shape, but present, living, real. She finished her coffee. On the ride home from Cutter's Creek, Clara fell asleep against Evelyn's side in the wagon, the same way she'd fallen asleep against her in the canyon, and Henry sat across from them and pretended to be interested in the passing landscape while very obviously listening to the conversation the adults were having. The conversation was mostly logistical: fencing schedule, supply orders for the coming month, the question of whether the farrier needed to make a special trip for Ajax's hind leg before the deep cold settled in. Normal. Practical. The kind of conversation 2 people had when they'd stopped performing careful distance and started just talking. But at a certain point, Colton said, "Henry, are you listening to everything we're saying?" "No," Henry said, without turning from the window. "You're a bad liar," Colton said. "I know, Clara's the better liar." "I'm not lying, I'm asleep," Clara said, from against Evelyn's side without opening her eyes. Evelyn felt the laugh before she could decide not to show it, and then it was already showing, and Colton's expression did the thing it did now, more than before, more frequently, the thing that almost made it all the way to his eyes. And Henry finally stopped pretending to look at the landscape and grinned at his own boots. She put her arm around the sleeping, not sleeping Clara and felt the weight of the child against her side, solid and warm and entirely present, and watched the cold plains pass and the sky doing its winter things overhead, and she thought, "This is different from what I came here for. This is not what I thought was possible. It is possible anyway." The thought sat in her chest in the particular way that true things sat, not requiring anything, not demanding any response. Just present, like a fact about the world. She watched the road and held the child and let the thought be what it was. Gruder came to her the evening after Cutter's Creek. He came to the stable, which was where he always came when he wanted to talk, and she thought that was probably intentional, that the stable was neutral ground for both of them, the place where she'd first proved herself and where he'd first started the process of admitting it. He stood inside the door, as always, and she set down what she was doing and waited. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up again, though nothing like the storm, just the ordinary evening wind of the high plains, persistent and cold, and entirely survivable. "What he said today," Gruder said. "In town. You should know that wasn't something I expected." "I don't think he planned it," she said. "No." He turned his hat in his hands. He'd taken it off when he came in, which was the closest thing to a formal gesture she'd ever seen from him. "I've known Colton Hale for 11 years. I've worked this land with him through drought, and through Margaret's illness, and through the year after she died, which was the hardest year I've ever seen a man survive." He looked at his hat. "I've been protective of him. Maybe too protective." "You were doing what you believed was right. I believed wrong things about you." She thought about the conversation they'd had in the stable. The first one, his flat accusation dressed in careful language, his certainty that she was something she wasn't. She thought about how much easier those weeks would have been with a different foreman, and she thought about how different the whole autumn might have looked if she'd had an easier road. "You weren't the only one," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He looked up from the hat. He looked at her directly, the way he'd been looking at her since the morning after the rescue, with the particular quality of a man who had recalibrated and was no longer trying to hide the recalibration. "I was wrong," he said. "I want to say it straight." She held his gaze. She thought about what Walt had said. Fair and quick aren't always the same thing. She thought about what it cost a man like Gruder to stand in a stable and say he was wrong, how many internal negotiations it had required, how long he'd been working toward this particular 3 words. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He put his hat back on. He turned to go. At the door he stopped, and she waited for whatever was coming, because she'd learned that the things he said at the door on his way out were usually the most important ones. "He's going to ask you something," Gruder said. He said it to the door. "I don't know when, but I know him, and I know what he looks like when he's working toward something important, and I've been watching him work toward it for a few weeks now." He paused. "I'm not telling you what to answer. I'm just—" He stopped again. "You should know it's coming, so you're not caught off guard." He walked out. She stood in the stable with Ajax shifting in his stall behind her, and the wind working at the walls and the lantern making its quiet light across all of it, and she stood there for a long moment with what Gruder had said. She thought about the night at the paddock fence. She thought about a man who said she sounds like she was Claire's kind of person, and understood in the marrow of her what that meant. She thought about 2 dark-haired children who had found her in the dark and decided, without asking anyone's permission, that she was theirs. She picked up the lantern and walked through the stalls one more time, the last check of the evening, speaking quietly to each horse in turn. Ajax last, as always. He turned toward her when she reached him, without waiting, his head coming around with the particular ease of an animal that has settled into trust. "Good boy," she said. She stood with her hand on his neck, and she thought about what was possible and what she'd believed was possible when she'd arrived here with a worn travel bag and 2 empty hands, and how those 2 things were not the same map at all. The night was very clear. The stars, through the gap in the stable roof where she'd been meaning to patch a board, were the winter kind, sharp and cold and numerous enough to be almost loud. She blew out the lantern and walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark. And she was not the woman who had come here with nothing, though she was still the same person. She thought those 2 things might not be contradictions. She went to sleep. He asked her on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of January, which was not a romantic day in any traditional sense. It was 12 degrees, the ground was iron hard, and she was in the middle of rehanging the stable door that had warped in the deep cold and wouldn't close flush anymore. She had a hammer in one hand and a shim in the other, and her coat was dirty from where she'd been kneeling on the frozen ground checking the bottom hinge. And that was how Colton Hale found her when he came across the yard with his hands in his pockets, and the specific look on his face that she recognized now as a man who had been working toward something for a long time and had finally arrived. She saw his expression and set the hammer down on the top of the fence post and waited. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the door because sometimes a man needed to look at something neutral while he was getting to the thing he actually meant to say. "The door's been giving me trouble since November," he said. "I know. I'm fixing it." "I see that." A pause. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know that too." He looked at her then. Gruder told you. Gruder told me something was coming. He didn't tell me what. She kept her voice even, but she could feel her own heartbeat doing something inconvenient. I figured out the rest. He was quiet for a moment. The cold moved between them, and the wind lifted something small across the yard. A piece of straw, a dry leaf, and let it go again. I'm not good at this, he said. I want to say that first. I wasn't even good at it the first time, and I had the advantage of being 24 and less aware of everything that can go wrong. All right, she said. I'm not asking out of... I want you to understand that it's not about the children, though they're part of it. It's not about the ranch or practicality or... I have enough practical reasons. That's not what this is. He stopped. His jaw worked. She waited. I spent a year after Margaret died being completely certain that everything that mattered had already happened to me. That the part of my life that had... He paused. That the good part was finished, and I was managing the rest of it. I was getting through. He looked at her directly. You made me wrong about that. Not on purpose. Not by trying to. Just by being what you are. The way you are. He took his hands out of his pockets. I'm asking you to marry me. I understand if the answer is no. I understand if you need time. I needed to say it. She stood with the shim in her hand and the cold in her face, and she looked at this man, this difficult, quiet, imperfect man who had taken 11 months to put his dead wife's horse's name in a footnote, who stood in hallways outside his children's room listening to someone else do the things he couldn't figure out how to do, who had walked into a canyon camp with empty hands and absolute certainty, who had stood up in a feed hall in front of everyone he knew and said the truth plainly without making it a performance. And she thought about who she'd been when she came here. She thought about what she'd believed was possible. Yes, she said. He looked at her like he wasn't entirely sure he'd heard correctly. Yes, she said again. The answer is yes. Something happened in his face. Not a smile exactly. Colton Hale's face didn't move that way, even now. But something that was doing the same work a smile would do. Something that came from somewhere deep and real, and had probably been waiting a long time for somewhere to go. He crossed the distance between them and put his hand against her face, cold palm against cold cheek, and she leaned into it, and they stood there in the frozen yard with the stable door still hanging wrong and the hammer sitting on the fence post. And it wasn't elegant, and it wasn't how anyone would have arranged it if they were arranging things for the best effect. It was just two people in a cold January yard deciding to be something to each other. He rested his forehead against hers briefly. Then he stepped back. The door, he said. Yes, she said. I'll hold the frame while you set the shim. She picked up the hammer. He held the frame. They fixed the door. The twins found out that afternoon. She hadn't been consulted on how to tell them, which she'd been slightly anxious about. Not because she didn't trust Colton to handle it, but because she knew his children, and she knew that Henry would need the information delivered in a specific way, or he'd build a complicated architecture of feelings around it that would take weeks to dismantle. And Clara would know something was happening before anyone said a word, and would resent being the last to be told officially. But Colton had lived with these children for 7 years and knew them in ways she was still learning, and she told herself to step back and let it be his. She was at the paddock fence when they came out. Henry came first, moving at the controlled fast pace of a child who had been told to walk and was doing the technical minimum of walking. He stopped at the fence beside her and looked at the horses, and she could see him doing the thing, the internal architecture thing, and she waited. Papa said you're going to get married, he said. We are. That means you'd be... He stopped. He started again. That you'd stay here. Permanently. Yes. He turned and looked at her with his father's eyes, that flat Winter Creek color, but wide open the way his father's rarely were. Were you going to leave? She thought about the honest answer. I hadn't thought that far, she said. But in the spring, when the season ended, there was always the question of what came next. Yes. He absorbed this. So you might have left. I might have, if things had gone differently. But they didn't. No, they didn't. He turned back to the horses. He was quiet for another moment, doing the architecture. I think it's good, he said finally. I want you to know that I think it's good. I'm not I have some feelings that are more complicated, but the main thing is that I think it's good. I appreciate you telling me both parts, she said. Clara cried, he said. But she'll say she didn't, so don't mention it. She didn't have time to respond to that because Clara arrived at the fence on the other side of her, and Henry was correct that Clara's eyes were slightly red, and Henry was also correct that Clara's expression dared anyone to say anything about it. Henry talks too much, Claire said. He said you cried. I didn't cry. A pause. I was emotional. That's different. Evelyn looked at her. Clara looked at the horses with great concentration. Are you all right? Evelyn asked. Yes. A beat. She stopped. She started again, and the careful adult composure that she'd been practicing slipped a little, and underneath it was just a 7-year-old girl. I was afraid you were only going to stay for the winter. I know, Evelyn said. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to ask for something I didn't have a right to ask for. She thought about herself at 7, which was a long time ago, but she remembered enough to know that this was the kind of thought that a child shouldn't have to have. The thought that some people were available to ask things of and other people weren't, and the difficulty of learning which was which. You have a right to ask me things, she said. You both do. She looked at the two of them, one on either side of her. That's what this means. You can ask me things. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned against Evelyn's arm the way she did, the easy, unself-conscious lean of a child who had decided this was her person and had stopped questioning it. And she said, Can we start the sewing soon? Yes, Evelyn said. We can start the sewing. Henry, on her other side, made a brief sound that was either commentary on sewing or on his feelings in general, and she put her arm around him anyway. And the three of them stood at the fence and watched Ajax move along the far rail in the cold afternoon light. They were married in March when the first real thaw came. It was not a large wedding. Evelyn would not have wanted a large wedding, and Colton had not suggested one. And the result was something that felt less like a performance and more like a fact being stated in the company of people who mattered. Sheriff Briggs and his wife, Walt and Shorty, a handful of people from Cutter's Creek who had come around to understanding what they'd gotten wrong. Mrs. Porter, who arrived with a cake she'd made the previous day, and who cried during the ceremony in the way that older women sometimes did at weddings, not sadly, but with the particular emotion of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand that good things deserved acknowledging. Gruder stood in the back. He did not cry. He stood with his arms crossed and his hat in his hands and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man who had made peace with something he'd resisted, and at a certain point during the ceremony she looked at him briefly across the room, and he looked back and gave her the smallest possible nod, the size of a nod that cost something to give. And she understood exactly what it meant. It meant, all right. It meant, I was wrong and I know it. It meant, in the language of a man who didn't have another language available, welcome. She nodded back. The ceremony itself was simple. Colton said the words he'd prepared in the direct way he said all things. No performance, no borrowed flourish, just what he meant, stated plainly. She said hers the same way, because that was who she was too, and she thought that was probably one of the things they had most in common, the preference for meaning over presentation, the discomfort with saying more than the truth required. Henry stood beside his father. Clara stood beside Evelyn, in a dress Clara had helped choose, and which she'd begun teaching Clara to alter herself. Not well yet, the seams were still uneven, but the intent was there. Clara held the small bouquet of early spring flowers that she'd spent an entire morning assembling with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. She held it with both hands and stood very straight and looked at the front of the room with an expression of such focused solemnity that Shorty, standing nearby, had to look at the floor briefly. When it was done, when the simple, plain, true thing was said and agreed to, Evelyn looked at Colton and he looked at her, and they were the same two people they'd been in the stable yard in January, and in the canyon in November, and in the hallway outside the children's room in the dark. They had not transformed into anyone else. That was, she thought, the whole point. What she understood in the months that followed was something she'd been learning in pieces since she arrived, but which now assembled itself into a shape she could see whole. She had come to Black Ridge Ranch believing she was surviving. And she was surviving. The practical fact of it, the work and the wages and the roof, was real. And she'd needed all of it. But survival had turned out to be the container, not the contents. Inside the surviving, without her having arranged it or intended it or even noticed it happening until it was already true, she had started to live again. This is what nobody tells you about grief, or at least nobody told her, that it doesn't end, it doesn't resolve, it doesn't step back and make room and let you move into a new chapter cleanly. What actually happens is that life accumulates around it, and the grief is still there, intact, but it becomes one of many things rather than the only thing. Lily was still gone. Thomas was still gone. The hole in her was still shaped like them, would always be shaped like them, but around the edges of that shape, other things had grown, rough and imperfect, and nothing like what she'd lost. Not a replacement for any of it, but real in their own right. Henry's questions, Clara's lean, Ajax turning toward the door. A man who told her the truth rather than the reassurance, and asked her what her daughter had been like rather than what had happened to her. You didn't get over loss. You grew around it. You built a life that could hold both the loss and the living, and the key was not to wait until the grief was smaller before you started building. The key was to start building while the grief was still enormous, and trust that you were large enough to hold both. She hadn't known she was large enough. She'd found out by accident, the way most true things were found. Not through intention, but through showing up and doing the work and refusing to leave even when it was unwelcoming, and letting what was real reveal itself in its own time. The eastern pasture went in that spring the way Margaret had wanted. Colton had it fenced and grazed by May, and on the first morning the cattle were moved there, he stood at the fence line and looked at it for a long time, and Evelyn stood beside him, and she knew he was doing several things at once, seeing what it was and seeing what it had taken to get here, and holding both the accomplishment and the person who'd wanted it and couldn't be here to see it. She didn't try to interrupt that. She just stood beside him while he did it. After a while, he said, she'd have had opinions about the fence spacing. Would she have been right? Almost certainly. He paused. She usually was. Then it's good you spaced it the way you did. He looked at her sideways. I spaced it the way she would have said to space it. I looked at her notes. Smart, Evelyn said. She was smart, he said. That's why I wrote down what she said. She thought there was something important in that. A man who could look at the cattle his dead wife had wanted and say simply, she was smart and mean it without the weight of it crushing him. That was not where he'd been in November. That was not the man with all the lights out. That was something else. Something on the other side of a long and difficult passage. Not arrived at cleanly, but arrived at. She reached over and took his hand, which was still not something they did without intention. They were not, either of them, instinctively demonstrative people, and the easy physical language of affection was something they were still learning together, imperfectly, without a map. He looked down at her hand in his, and then looked back at the pasture. He didn't let go. Clara learned to sew that summer. Not well. The seams were still uneven, and she had her mother's stubbornness, which meant she'd redo a thing 4 times before she'd ask for help, which meant sometimes the 4th attempt was worse than the first. But she learned, and by August she'd made a small pillow that was crooked in 2 directions and had a button that didn't sit right, and which she presented to Evelyn one evening with the expression of a person who had decided in advance to be defended about its quality. I know it's not straight, Clara said. Evelyn turned it over in her hands. She looked at the seams, the slightly off-center button, the corner that had puckered because Clara had been pressing too hard when she turned it. I can see exactly where you made each decision, she said. The corner you rushed, the seam you redid, the button you placed 3 times before you left it there. She looked up. That's not a bad thing. That's just what a first real piece looks like. You learn more from this than from something that came out perfect. Clara looked at her with the 7-year-old version of skeptical. You're just saying that. I'm saying it because it's true. If you'd handed me a perfectly made pillow, I'd wonder if you'd actually done it. She set it down. Next one will be better. Not perfect. Better. Clara looked at the pillow. Can I make something bigger next? What do you want to make? A curtain, Clara said. For my window. Mine keeps letting the cold in. That's practical. Henry says I should make his first because boys are more important. She said it with the precise detonative calm of a sibling who has been thinking about the best way to deliver this information. I told him that was wrong in several ways. It is wrong in several ways, Evelyn agreed. I know. Clara picked up the pillow. I'm going to keep this one, even if it's crooked. Good, Evelyn said. She watched Clara go upstairs, pillow tucked under her arm, and she thought about her own mother teaching her to sew. At a table in Kansas, and the feeling of sitting beside someone who knew more than you and was willing to show you, and how that simple act of showing, patient, repeated, unhurried, was one of the most ordinary forms of love there was. Not grand, not dramatic, just someone with knowledge making space at the table and saying, "Come sit with me, I'll show you how." That was what she had been given in the years before she lost everything. That was also what she had been given here, in a different form, by different people. Walt holding the lantern while she drove nails into a board. Mrs. Briggs handing her a cup of coffee and telling her the difference between careful and appropriate. Gruder's footnote of a nod that meant welcome. All of it the same thing in different language. Come sit with me. You're not where you thought you'd be, but you're not nowhere either. Sit down. We'll figure out what comes next. She went to the kitchen and started dinner because dinner needed starting, and that was something she could do. Ajax died in the fall of the following year, quietly, in his stall, the way old horses sometimes did when they had finally decided they were done. He'd been declining since summer. The hitch in his hind leg becoming something else, something in his chest, something that the farrier and the veterinarian they brought out from the county seat agreed was simply age accumulating past what could be managed. She'd spent more time in his stall that last month than she had in the stable at large, sitting with him in the evenings, not doing anything in particular, just being present the way she'd been present for him from the beginning. Colton found her there the morning after, sitting on the stable floor with her back against the stall door. He came in and looked at the stall and stood for a moment with everything that Ajax had meant to him moving across his face, not hidden, not managed, just felt. Then he sat down on the floor beside her, which was not a thing Colton Hale did, sit on stable floors. But he did it now, and they sat together in the quiet of the stall. He had a good last year, she said. He did. He came back to himself. She'd thought about how to say this and hadn't found a better way. When I came, he'd gone somewhere inside himself. By the end, he was back. Margaret would have liked knowing that, Colton said. He said her name without the practiced quality now. Just her name, a person he'd loved, a fact of his life. I think he was waiting, Evelyn said. Not for the right person, just for someone willing to wait with him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat on the stable floor in the cold morning light and let it be what it was. Loss and love and the specific understanding that some things end and that their ending doesn't erase what they were. That was the truth of it. That was the whole truth. As best she'd come to understand it, things ended, people left, the world did not arrange itself to spare you. What you had was what you built, day by day, in the ordinary hours, out of imperfect material with imperfect hands. The family you made from whoever showed up and stayed. The home you grew from a place that was once just a job on a piece of frozen ground. She had come to Black Ridge Ranch with a worn travel bag and 2 empty hands, and she had not been saved by anyone or rescued from anything. She had worked, she had stayed, she had refused, quietly and without announcement, to be less than what she was, even when what she was made people uncomfortable, even when it would have been easier to make herself smaller, even when the easier thing was to keep walking and not stop for 2 dark-haired children crying in the dark. That refusal was not heroism. She was clear-eyed about that. It was just the only thing she knew how to be, the thing her mother had built into her before she left, the thing that had survived Thomas's death and Lily's death and the boarding house in Helena and the wagon that smelled like wet dog and all the rest of it. Not courage exactly, more like stubbornness in the direction of being fully alive. The frontier did not care about you. The land did not care. The weather did not care. The distances did not care. The only warmth that existed out here was what people made for each other, deliberately, against all the cold. It was not guaranteed. It was not given. It was built, badly and slowly and imperfectly, by people who kept showing up anyway. She had kept showing up. It had been, she thought, sitting on the stable floor with her husband's arm around her, listening to the ordinary sounds of the horses beginning their morning. Enough. More than enough. It had been everything.